The seeds of ruin cast by Archon had blossomed well upon the fertile soil of Hive Centaurus. The former planetary capital, a title now claimed by one of the Hive cities on the other side of the ocean, had changed greatly since the arrival of the Forsaken Sons. It had been here that the touch of chaos had been the strongest, no matter the efforts of the ecclesiarchy. It had been here that a shadow war had been waged between two hidden powers, the agenda of one remaining a mystery to the other despite having claimed victory at the tip of a chainsword. The Hive stretched from horizon to horizon. It was broad enough to house 2 billion people and the industry they had fed with their strength. This industry had been given a new purpose. Now, it churned out bolt shells of various caliber and a myriad other items that the Warband needed. Entire manufactorium had been ruined by the battles and the riots that had preceded the invasion, but what remained was being used to the maximum. The industry of war had seized the portions of the Hive not given over to carnage, looting, and the rituals of the disciples of the Dark Creed, all in preparation for the next stage of the war. And it was also in preparation of that stage that Decaros had arranged the events of this day. The former Alpha Legionary stood at the balcony of one of the governor's palace's aisles. From this vantage point, he could see the millions of enslaved souls milling around, going to work. Many more were singing the praises of the Chaos Gods at the feet of the monuments built under the supervision of the Forsaken Sons bearing the gene seed of the 17th Legion. Some had been illuminated long before the arrival of the traitor Marines, but many more had turned from the Emperor when the skies had started to burn with the fires of vengeance. In defeat, they had sworn their allegiance to the ruinous powers, hoping to save their lives by abandoning the faith of the so-called ecclesiarchy. They were little more than wretches, though, of no use beyond serving the whims of the Forsaken Sons. Millions had died in the battle for Hive Centaurus, but many more had survived and become the subjects of a new ruler. While Archon's dominion over the Hive was unchallenged, the Awakened One had more pressing concerns than the administration of a city. Instead, he had let his warriors do as they saw fit, and, eager to impress their lord, they had begun to turn the Hive into a valuable asset. Packs of iron warriors and tech priests had come from the hand of ruin to put the slaves to work, while others sacked the city of all that could be of use, putting to use their experience on Mula Prime. A few fleshmasters with no interest in the Unbound unleashed in Hive Anister were wandering the streets. Groups of malformed servants and vat-grown creatures accompanied them as they sought fresh specimens amongst the Hive for their experiments. All in all, it was an efficient arrangement, but one which would only last as long as the Forsaken Sons were present to enforce it. Once the Astartes had left, utter chaos would claim the Hive, and the mortals would tear it apart, driven to insanity by the whims of the demons that even now spoke to them in their dreams, seeking to use them to infiltrate the material universe. A new rule needed to be established, and fortunately, the means by which the Hive had been conquered had left plenty of candidates. Decaros had used many groups of renegade humans to help him weaken the planet in preparation for the invasion. Many had been destroyed during the actual battle, slaughtered by the Loyalists and giving their lives to help the cause of the Forsaken Sons. But some, the most powerful and therefore useful, had survived, and it was time for them to receive the rewards they had been promised. His agents, hypno-trained individuals who answered to none but him, had delivered his summoning to all of the various factions' leaders. Now, the designated time was drawing near, and soon the curtain would raise on a gathering such as the galaxy had rarely seen. Valamus Galliard, lord of his house, outwardly appeared to be the very incarnation of calm. He was sitting at the back of his limo, looking through the tinted, reinforced windows, utterly unconcerned with the misery and suffering he saw. He held in his right hand the letter that had been delivered to his estate the day before. The sheet of paper had been read so many times it was covered in creases, and Valamus knew its contents by heart. To the attention of Valamus Galliard, you are called to a gathering of your peers, taking place tomorrow at midday in what was once called the Hall of Celebrations. You might bring with you an escort of 4, and any weapon you may wish to, provided it can be carried by yourself or your chosen companions. The gathering will be held under the protection of the Forsaken Sons, by Archon's own will, and Decaros will bring retribution to any who would break the peace of the talks and celebrations. At the end of the parchment was the address of the door by which he would be admitted into the gigantic governor's palace. Of course, there had been no question of refusing the invitation. Decaros had been the one who had approached Valamus through a chain of intermediaries in the months before the attack, when the madness of the warp storm was just beginning to abate. His agents had known everything about House Galliard, from the exact number of their staff to the fact that they had sold weapons to both sides of the heresy, as well as the security codes of every room of the estate. The man behind these contacts, at the time, Valamus hadn't known his true nature, could have destroyed the house in 100 different ways, and made sure that Valamus knew it before making his offer. In return for the Gaillard's support in the preparations of what had then been called the Arrival, the waning fortunes of the house would be restored. Furthermore, an opportunity would be granted, after the Arrival, to seize power beyond Valamus' imagination. Accepting had been the obvious decision, and Valamus regretted nothing. Watching the unleashed might of the Forsaken Sons, it was obvious that refusing and trying to fight back would have accomplished nothing beyond the extinction of House Gaillard. Once the deal had been made and the alliance sealed by delivering all the information Gaillard had on the system's defenses and military forces, the mysterious individual had made good on his word. Millions of credits had flowed into the coffers of the house, much of which had to be reinvested in other ventures specified by the benefactor. But the commission Valamus was allowed alone were more than enough to save the house from the ruin that had threatened it since the end of the heresy. Over time, the requests had changed, becoming more varied and dangerous. To his own surprise, Valamus had come to enjoy the challenges these demands represented. This was much similar to the game of intrigues nobility had waged since Terra's antiquity, but the stakes were much higher. He had arranged for weapons to be delivered to other groups, for shipments of food to be lost, and on several occasions, had planned and ordered the murder of some high-value target. Had a single one of these acts been uncovered, he would have been executed at once. But the Gaillard family had an extensive network of agents for these kinds of tasks, gathered during the years. Whether these individuals realized they were now working against the Imperium instead of simply furthering the interest of House Gaillard didn't seem to matter to them. They were given several times the usual fee in return for their services and silence. As months passed, many of them were added to Valamus' growing circle of aware co-conspirators. By the time of the Arrival, dozens of Valamus kin, employees and associates had been brought into what the House Lord had dubbed the Shadow House. Of all of them, though, only Valamus himself had ever met their mysterious sponsor in person. The meeting had been organized to make sure he understood who and what he was dealing with. It had been the first time Valamus had seen a space marine in his life, and he had been terrified. To think hundreds of the Surhuman warriors' kindred would come. How could any force oppose such a gathering of military power? The only smart move was to join them, and try to get as much as possible from the whole thing. The unforeseen arrival of the Loyalist Astartes only changed one thing: the victory of the Forsaken Sons was even more important. House Gaillard's involvement with the invaders had become obvious, and they would all die if the Sons of Calth prevailed. So far, the situation appeared to be in the renegade's favor, but Valamus knew enough about warfare not to take anything for granted. That made the upcoming gathering primordial, if only because of the chance to obtain more information. Still, there would be dangers as well, and the greatest of those would doubtlessly be the other attendees. Valamus didn't know who else had been summoned, but he had gathered a list of those he suspected had been Decoros agents as well. It was based on speculation from his own orders and intelligence gathered by his agents during their missions, and not a single entity on it was someone he would turn his back to. Which was why he had carefully picked the 4 companions who were sitting with him in the limo. One of them was a nameless servitor, who appeared to be nothing more than a recording scribe, and indeed could fulfill that function perfectly, but had been heavily modified by bribed tech priests. It was, in fact, a deadly bodyguard whose only priority was the protection of Valamus' life. Hidden beneath its skin were dozens of weapons and defensive mechanisms, while its skull had been filled with sensors, forever looking for threats. As far as its master was concerned, the fact that the servitor's fleshy components had once belonged to one of his cousins was just another advantage. As a punishment for trying to kill Valamus and claim lordship over the house, the brain-dead, would-be usurper would protect him forever in death. The message to the rest of the family hadn't been missed by anyone. The second of Valamus' escorts was a hulking brute of a man, wearing custom body armor and carrying a very visible bolter. His name was Talak, and there were many amongst the Gaillard's household who joked that he must have Ogrin blood in his veins, always behind his back, and low enough that he wouldn't overhear. But while it was true that Talak's scarred and blunt face would never win any beauty contest, his mind was that of a cold-blooded killer who had performed on Valamus' instructions numerous times. The man was one of the best troubleshooters on the house's payroll, if not the best, but he was probably the most loyal. Other organizations had tried to buy his services on several occasions. Fortunately for Valamus, and unfortunately for the would-be employers, Talak had a very strong sense of loyalty and considered such attempts to be attacks against House Galliard. Sitting opposite to Talak and next to Valamus, Amelia couldn't have been more different from the hitman. She was dressed like a lady of the high society, but her black, tight body glove was actually made of a reactive material that would harden at the first impact. The jewelry she wore was also stuffed with technological wonders, some of which came from the Dark Age and others from prescribed dealings with Xenos. Even she didn't know half of their potential uses, but the skills she possessed and the edge they gave her were more than enough for Valamus to want the female agent to his side. Amelia was as beautiful as she was deadly, clever and more importantly, completely devoid of morals, which had made her a very useful assassin since Valamus had gotten her out of the slums, some 20 years ago. The last of Valamus' companions was cowering in one extremity of the vehicle, holding his head in both hands while endlessly mumbling to himself. Valamus had long debated whether or not to bring him at all, but there were just too many potential situations where Jar's peculiar talents could be useful. As an unbound psyker, he could protect Valamus from psychic intrusion and compulsion, but the small, skinny man could do much more. If his master turned off his dampening collar completely, Jar would become a very potent if somehow unreliable weapon. The Gamma-class psyker, according to the corrupt administratum adept who had been paid off to let him escape the black ships, was kept under control by chemical injections and being treated like a prince when in his warded room in the estate. Some had questioned Valamus' generosity toward a being who are, at best, a second-class citizen of the Imperium, and at worst a walking abomination whose mere existence endangered all those around him. Valamus' thoughts on that subject were simple: in case Jar somehow slipped the leash, better not to give him any reason to go straight after Valamus. Jar had spent the last months in a drug-induced coma, after the storm had arrived and nearly driven him insane. 12 servants of House Galliard had been torn apart by his uncontrolled powers before Valamus had shut him down with a triple dose of his collar's injections. It was only because Decaros had given him an upgraded version, for reasons the Astartes had never told, and that Valamus hadn't questioned, that the noble had even begun to consider awakening the little word. There would be other psychers at the gathering, perhaps even one of the Forsaken Sun sorcerers. Valamus wasn't about to walk into that particular viper's nest without being even able to trust his own thoughts. For despite the aura of calm he projected, the Lord of House Galliard was acutely aware that he could very well be going to his death. Valamus was under no illusion that his life held any special value to the Forsaken Sons. They were conquerors of worlds, whose deeds had shaped the galaxy into what it was now. To them, Valamus was at best a useful pawn, and at worst a burden no longer of use. He intended to do all he could to convince his masters that he was still of use, and deserved the rewards that had been promised to him. At least, from his dealings with Decaros, he knew that the Forsaken Sons were pragmatic, and wouldn't kill all of their mortal agents at the gathering just for the hell of it. The limo, whose driver had been a faithful servant of the house all his life, like his forebears on 3 generations, parked in front of the entrance to the governor's palace indicated at the invitation's back. The door was a small opening in the wall, made for servants to move in and out without disturbing their betters. Valamus wondered if there was a deliberate message there, or if the entrance had simply been chosen because it was the closest to where the gathering would be held. Regardless of the gate's prestige, however, it was well guarded. 2 Astartes in sea green armor stood at attention, their bolter held at their chest, ready to slay any of the few, terrified people who hastened through the street. Forcing his composure to remain undisturbed by an effort of will, Valamus led his companions toward the giant, still holding the summoning in his hand. They didn't open fire, in fact, they barely reacted to their approach. As Valamus neared the door, it opened, revealing a small figure covered in dirty rags that didn't let a single spot of skin exposed. A beak of metal emerged from the shadows of the creature's hood, and it carried a rolled scroll under its arm. "Hello, sires and lady," it said, its voice rasping and its tone reverent. "Have you come here for the Great Ones?" "I have come here upon Decaros' summon," answered Valamus, holding the parchment before what he supposed was the creature's face. "Ah, yes, of course. Many sires have come today for the Great Ones. You may enter, of course, but first the master has ordered me to check you are on the list." With very careful movements, as if manipulating his holy relic, it unfurled the scroll it bore, and pulled out a stylus from its rags. "What is your name, sire?" "I am Valamus Galliard, Lord of House Galliard," told the nobleman, offended that he had to justify his presence to this wretch. There was no doubt of it now, Decorose was deliberately reminding them of their place. Fine, Valamus could play his game, though he did wonder, for a second, if the Astartes would have reacted had he simply ordered his cohorts to get the creature out of the way. After checking that, yes, Valamus' name was on the list, and writing a cross in front of it with trembling fingers, the creature let the group in and told them to simply walk straight down the corridor. They would find the room where the other sires were waiting for the Great One who had called them, but they must not wander, or the Master couldn't guarantee their safety. As they strolled down the corridor, noticing the marks of last fire and bolt impact left on the walls, Valamus wondered if there wasn't another layer to the message given by the creature's presence. Who knew how exactly the Forsaken Sons had found this being? Perhaps at some point it had been a normal human, and facing him was intended as a reminder of what could happen to traitors and failures. Or perhaps it was just the Forsaken Sons using whoever was available for what was, in fairness, an insignificant task. Valamus wasn't going to ask Decorose, anyway. He had another source, though. "Jar," he called to the Psyker. "What did you feel about our diminutive host?" "Naught but a flicker," babbled Jar, his brain so loaded with tranquilizers he could barely walk. "Its spark is weak and false and birthed from metal and cables. It has no name but the servant, and no purpose but to obey and to watch for its master, in the shadows." From what little sense Valamus could make out of his witch's words, it seemed the creature was an artificial being, created in a lab somewhere. Another formerly forbidden science the Forsaken Sons had dabbled into. He wondered if there was anything the renegade Astartes would not do, no taboo they would not break if there was even just the most remote possibility it could be of use. Creating life was hardly uncommon in the Imperium. Without specially designed life forms, how could the most savage worlds brought to a state where they were inhabitable by mankind? But sapient life, of a sort, cloning did exist in the Mechonicus, but its use was restrained by many rules. The creation of a whole new being such as the servant was, no matter how harmless the creature may look, something straight from the horrors that had led to the long night. "Are you all right?" asked Amelia. Valamus shook himself mentally. He must have let his thoughts appear on his face, an unforgivable mistake for a scion of Galliard. "I am fine," he snapped back. "Now, stand ready, all of you. We are almost there, and there is no telling what awaits us on the other side." The door they had reached was plain, but Valamus could hear the whispers on the other side, and Jar's increasing trembling and mumbling were all the clues he needed. Whoever Decorose had also summoned, their surface thoughts and auras alone were enough to cause fear to one whose soul was perpetually on the brink of the abyss. But there was no turning back, there never had been a chance of that. It was time to begin the game that, if he played his cards well and fate smiled upon him, would see him reach heights of power no Lord of Galliard had ever known. He took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. Decorose watched the gathering, registering the postures of each group and who was talking to whom. Already he could see alliances begin to form and old rivalries and hatred come to the fore. The room, which had once been used as a ballroom for the amusement of the city's worthies, held about 50 people. The last of the guests had just arrived, a full hour before the actual time of the summon. None of Decoro's servants had wanted to risk being late, and simply being the last had apparently shaken the concerned leader. 5 Astartes stood guard over the proceedings, all of them wearing the colors of the Alpha Legion. Like Decorose himself, they still bore the emblem of the Hydra on their shoulder pauldron. They were part of the group who had joined the former infiltrator, submitting to his leadership for the duration of the Parascasian War. Contrary to Decoro's fears, his work on the Hive world had been wildly recognized amongst the Warband, especially by his Gene brothers. They had come to help him secure the holdings of the Forsaken Sons, and they understood the importance of this meeting. More of them were keeping watch outside, to ensure the security of the valuable pawns Decorose had gathered. The Lord of Shadows, as some of his brothers had come to call him, was sitting upon a throne specially built to bear the weight of an Astartes, carved with demonic figures writhing as if in agony and crowned by a representation of the Warband's emblem. The throne had been made in the workshops of the Hand of Ruin, by some of the slaves taken from the Mueller campaign. The entrails of the ship had also produced the new suit of power armor that Decorose was wearing, a magnificent model, forged by Mercurian himself upon Arkan's command. It was encrusted with priceless emeralds, and a hydra with eyes of ruby decorated the chestplate, and a cloak made of the fur of a Fenrisian wolf, slain during one of the battles fought by the members of the Forsaken Sons during the heresy, hung from its shoulders. It was far too gaudy for Decaro's taste, but it would be very useful today. In following with the traditions of his legion, today the Astartes had renounced to the absence of officers' marks that made the Alpha Legion such a confusing foe on the battlefield. Today, he had to be imposing enough to remember the mortals in attendance just who was in charge here. For an entire hour, until the appointed time finally arrived, he watched like a king of old, contemplating the intrigues of his court. Creatures who were more or less human, or had been at some point in their existence, cast fearful glances in his direction before quickly looking away. The tension in the air grew higher as the minutes passed, and the glasses of wine liberated from the former governor's cellar and distributed by Decaro's agents remained largely untouched. Maybe some of the guests feared poison, as more than one of them probably recognized the waiters as one of the mine-wiped middlemen the Lord of Shadows had employed in his dealings with them. More probably, they wanted their intellect to be unclouded. Even from the estrade upon which his throne was placed and through the filters of his helmet, Decaros could smell the fear in most of them, those who were still human enough to feel such an emotion. Anyway, many of them had been touched by the dark gods in an obvious fashion, bearing upon their flesh the mark of their favor, or disgrace, depending to the case. Others appeared untouched at a glance, but Decaros could feel the taint within them, just like he had felt it on that traitor scribe. Their souls were being changed, and they would probably never realize it. Then again, it wasn't as if Decaros himself was still the same man who had fled terror aboard the Hand of Ruin. At last, the time arrived, and he rose from his throne. The conversations silenced at once, and all eyes turned to the one who had made all the mortals present into traitors to the Imperium. He removed his helmet, exposing his rude, scarred features, and gave the priceless piece of armor to one of his attendants. It was important that they saw his face as he spoke to them. "I bid you all welcome," began the legionary, his voice carried across the vast room by its carefully studied acoustics. "All of you are people of this world, and 9 of you are leaders of men who were smart enough to join their forces to the inevitable victory of my brothers. You helped me prepare the way for the arrival of the Forsaken Sons. In return, you were all promised varying rewards, and a chance for power. Today, I shall give you what you are due. The rewards await in these coffers," he continued, gesturing behind him, where servitors were carrying 9 different storage devices. "The power, though, I cannot give you, for power is worthless when it is given. All here know that it must be taken. My brothers have come to this world, as I told you they would. But our war is only beginning. The lapdogs of the false emperor still keep an entire continent out of our grasp. Half this world is denied to the Forsaken Sons, but it shall not be so for long. Soon, we will march against the sons of Calth and those who hide in their shadow, begging for their protection. We will teach these fools that there is no protection from the Forsaken Sons. In doing so, we will leave this city, just as one day we shall leave this system and move on to other conquests. It is as much to reward you as to prepare for that day, once we have crushed our enemies here, that I have summoned you." He had had their attention from the beginning, but now he could see the interest shining in their eyes. They could guess what he was about to say, though he doubted any of them could have anticipated the details of what he had planned. "It is you, and in time others like you, who shall rule this city in our absence, as well as the others who shall fall to our might. We Astartes are warriors and conquerors, not administrators or cenacles. We shall grant you the right to rule, as long as you acknowledge our authority and swear your undying allegiance." He paused, and saw the hunger in the eyes of the leaders who looked upon him and the ambition that burned in their souls. All of them commanded to hundreds of souls, and their influence spread all across the hive, shaping the destinies of tens of millions. Yet at the prospect of becoming rulers of an entire world, even under the yoke of the Forsaken Sons, to many amongst them, the sheer scope of the power this would grant them was enticing enough, while others thought of how they would help them further their own agenda. "Now," he continued, "I shall give you your rewards, and then we shall discuss of this city's, and this world's, future. Zerth, come forward and receive what you deserve." A male human came upon the estrade. Amongst the gathering of lords and masters, he and his ragged group were something of an exception. They wore prestigious but used clothing, covered in symbols of devotion to the ruinous powers. Their skin was marked with self-inflicted wounds, the scars forming crude patterns calling upon the favor of the dark gods. Their leader, who now faced the one who had elevated him above the other many petty rebels and street doomsayers of Paraxis, had his hands nearly covered in jewelry, and was clearly more terrified than honored by his situation. And rightly so. At Decaro's signal, one of the servitors approached. The cyborg carried a simple wooden box, a cube as broad as a forearm. It presented the item to Zerth, who took it in his trembling hands, still looking nervously in the Astartes' direction. "Open it." Zerth pushed away the panel at the box top, and looked into it. With a scream, he let go of the box, which fell on the floor, letting its contents spill out. A head rolled on the estrade, eliciting shouts of surprise and disgust from the crowd. Zerth's gaze was fixated on the gruesome trophy, and Decaros saw the look of horror and recognition in the mortal's eyes. The Lord of Shadows gave his wayward servant a smile entirely devoid of mirth. "Yes, Zerth. It is the head of your son, who you left with the rest of your group before coming here, running to be the first, hoping that it would be enough to make up for your failures. Between your departure and the beginning of this gathering, all of your pathetic group of lowlifes were killed by my brothers. And now, it is your turn." Too fast for the mortal eye to see, Decaros plunged his gauntleted hand through Zerth's chest. His ceramite-clad fingers pierced the man's skin in a shower and gore and tore apart the bones and organs beneath. At the same moment, the legionaries on the ballroom sides opened fire on the dying man's companions, ripping them to shreds with carefully controlled volleys of bolts. Only an instinctive knowledge that their own lives would be forfeit if they moved prevented the rest of the guests to run for the doors. "You failed me," said Decaros, in a soft whisper that was nonetheless heard by all those present. "You failed the Forsaken Sons. I was with the pack who fought in the streets you and your rabble were supposed to secure. One of my brothers was wounded by the Loyalists fighting the battle you should have fought. A son of the War Master, who has fought for hundreds of years across scores of worlds, lingers still between life and death because of your cowardice. You pathetic worm, did you really think that you would get away with this?" Zerth's body twitched, his lips moving frantically, desperately trying to stave off death even if just for a moment longer. Abject terror was inscribed on his face even as he quickly slipped into cold oblivion. Decaros threw off Zerth's corpse, and, with his hand still covered in the dead man's blood, gestured to the butchered remains. "Remember this, all of you. Remember that this is the price for failing or betraying us. Remember that, no matter your wealth and your might, the walls behind which you hide and the armies you command, we can end you just as easily as I ended this miserable worm." He could see that the message had been received. As planned, the contrast between the civility of the gathering and the brutality with which he had dispatched the traitor scum had taken them by surprise. Now that he had shown them the stick, it was time to distribute the carrots. "Kurgan," he called, "come forward and receive your reward." With well-concealed and understandable nervousness, another mortal stepped on the estrade, carefully avoiding the body of his predecessor and the expanding pool of blood around it. Kurgan was one of the most fervent opponents to the false emperor in the congregation, which is greatly ironic when one considered where Decaros had first found him. Once, Kurgan had been a priest of this aberration the Loyalists called the Ecclesiarchy. He had been taught the lies of the Lectitio Divinatus by the self-proclaimed Cardinal Tranos. But when Decaros had told him the truth, the universe had collapsed around the man. Decaros still didn't know how he himself felt about the accursed book. Part of him was appalled at how easily the humans had returned to the lies they had been freed from by the Great Crusade, while another found it darkly humorous that Lorga's first, misguided word would how horrify and enrage his whole legion. Regardless, the revelation of his holy book's history, how the word-bearer's Primarch had written it and been denounced for it, and how it had led to the whole heresy, had shattered Kurgan's faith. Decaros suspected that his faith in the Emperor had probably not been that strong to begin with. Many of the Emperor's faithful had known about the Lectito's author, and it hadn't dissuaded them from worshipping the tyrant. Still, Kurgan had proved most useful once steered toward a more honest and rewarding faith. He had spread the message of chaos in his sermons, slowly turning his flock to the ruinous powers until they would have spat on the Emperor's image without hesitation. The gods had blessed him with great oratory powers, and though most of his followers were wretches from the planet's slave workers, they numbered in the hundreds and were utterly devoted to him. In the initial attack, dozens of loyalist priests had been butchered by the minions of the apostate, breaking the morale of those who looked up to them for support. Kurgan's 4 companions were looking at the other legionaries, clearly wondering if they were about to open fire on them as well. All of them were members of Kurgan's cult, but they were vastly different from the pathetic creatures who had accompanied Zerth. They were trained fighters, equipped with the best weapons and armor their master's influence could obtain. The Pontifex Guard, they were called, using the title claimed by their lord with pride, and Decaros could see none of them were too happy about letting their legion charge walk alone before the marine. Good, it meant they had brains. Kurgan, like all the other leaders, would need competent bodyguards in the future. "You have served me well," declared Decaros, and Kurgan's shoulders relaxed slightly. "For months you have brought the word of chaos to the ignorant, teaching them to accept their true nature instead of denying it. You have done so with great conviction despite your limits, sharing your limited illumination. Now, it is time for you to be revealed deeper truths." Another servitor approached. This one carried a richly decorated box, covered in carvings of demons and Colchizian script that promised 1,000 agonies to the unworthy if they dared to open it. Fortunately, Kurgan couldn't read the language of the 17th Legion's homeworld, and opened the box without hesitation at Decaros' command. Within it was a tome that had first been written in the same language as the warding runes, but its script shifted endlessly through countless others, stopping only when its reader understood the words. The content, however, was always the same. It was the Book of Lorga, the word of the first Primarch to turn from the Emperor. This copy had been written aboard the Hand of Ruin, and altered into its current form by the baleful influence of the warp. The legionary who had written it had offered it to Archon precisely for that kind of situation, where it would be used to spread further the glory of the Pantheon. The book had been written on the flayed skin of the Ultramarines who had boarded the ship at Terra, using the fluids of butchered slaves as ink. Kurgan closed the box with reverence, and bowed deeply before Decaros, clutching the container to his chest like a newborn. Decaros could easily imagine the priest reading the tome for days on end, drinking deep of the tainted wisdom of Lorga. He hoped the mortal soul was strong enough to withstand such revelations as awaited him. The next to be called was Tarox, who led those who called themselves the Breakers. Like the creatures that composed the base of his horde, the renegade captain of the PDF still wore the remnants of his military uniform, with all emblems of allegiance to the Imperium torn away. During the heresy, Tarox's company had been the one most used to crush the terrified mobs into submission. Over time, the soldiers had come to enjoy the beatings and slaughter they inflicted, becoming more and more savage and cruel in the performance of their orders. When the storm had arrived, their flesh had been changed to reflect their souls. At first, those afflicted had been able to conceal their nature, but their changes had been revealed when they had next been unleashed. It had been Tarox who had then taken measures to keep the truth hidden. The PDF captain had feared, doubtlessly rightly, that his entire company would be purged if the mutations were discovered. So he had delayed the addition of priests to his troops, and attributed the reports of monsters and increased ruthlessness to the exaggeration of the people and the fact that the situation on the planet was growing ever more tense. But soon, it was no longer possible to keep up this masquerade. Too many bodies were piled up at the door of Tarox, some of them PDFs from other units who had seen too much during joint operations. More and more of Tarox's men had succumbed to mutation, and the captain had been forced to desert with those loyal to him into the Underhive, where hundreds more of mutants had flocked to his banner. In this lawless place, the freaks of nature and the ever-growing population of mutants created by the storm had seen him as a beacon, a force to which they could rally. These hundreds had turned to thousands when Decaros had given Tarox his support, providing the mutant overlord with weapons and supplies. In the depths, Tarox had built up an army, whose core was still formed by the creatures that had once been his men. One of the hulking mutants had been brought by its master to the gathering. The other 3 were human enough, capable of dissimulating their mutations with bandages or clothing, the most clever and cunning of Tarox's host. But the 4th could never have passed for human. It was a monster of red skin, overgrown muscles and bony outgrowths. It towered higher than an Astartes in power armor, and was constantly sharpening its claws against each other while looking around with hungry eyes. There was nothing human in these eyes, only mindless, animal urges and cruelty. Tarox had 100 such beasts under his command, all loyal to the death to him. Perhaps some part of their former existence remained, or perhaps their attachment to him was nothing more than a cruel joke of the dark gods. Tarox himself, who now stood before the Lord of Shadows, looked perfectly human. But Decaros knew that, beneath the man's skin, the touch of chaos was strong. Only through a will of iron powered by despair was the mortal postponing his own transformation into a mindless brute. That despair had been what Decaros had used to make the renegade soldier join his cabal. Inside the box containing Tarok's reward was a vial of crimson liquid, manufactured by the Fleshmasters in the Hall of Asclepius. The crew of the Hand of Ruin had been afflicted by mutations ever since the storm had been unleashed, but by Archon's command, the former apothecaries had sought a mean to limit the degeneration of the most valuable crew. The elixir, whose composition Decaros felt it was best not to know, didn't stop the mutating touch of the warp entirely. Such a feat was beyond even the skills of the greatest of sorcerers. But it would prevent Tarox from devolving for a time, until a more permanent cure could be found. Already one of Decaros' brothers in the Fleshmasters' ranks was in the palace, looking over data from the breakers, seeking to understand the particular strain of mutation that had touched them. Decaros just hoped that whatever alchemy gave Tarox control over the beasts wouldn't be broken by the genetic chirurgy. But for the mutant horde to remain of use, it was a risk that had to be taken. The moment Decaros told him the nature of his gift, Tarox opened the vial and drank its contents in one go, to the surprise of the onlookers. Bowing deeply to his lord, he returned to his men, and, to Decaros' hidden relief, the beast didn't react any differently. The Lord of Shadows supposed that it made sense, insofar as anything touched by chaos made sense. The breakers bore the mark of Khorne, and the Bloodfather cared nothing for the subtleties of genetic alteration and hormonal balance. Whatever hold Tarox had over the creatures must be of a more spiritual nature. After Tarox came the chosen representative of the Tenebrae Lex. Like all members of his group, he was almost entirely mechanized, though it was difficult to know for certain when one looked upon them. Debased robes of the Mechanicum covered much of their frames, and only utter blackness could be seen under their hoods, not even the light of optic sensors found on more typical tech priests. The Tenebrae Lex perceived the world around them through other, darker senses. Once, the group of techno-adepts had been dedicated to maintaining the myriad systems that had brought light to the hive. When the warp storm had engulfed Paraxis, one of the reclusive order had been infected by a sliver of corrupted code. The malice of the Empyrean had twisted the unfortunate's body and soul, and spread to his colleagues like a digital plague. Some creature from the beyond had turned the priests against each other, and a bloody, fratricidal war had been fought in the temples and tunnels of the Light Keepers. Decaros had lent his help to the demon-infected priests, ensuring that no word of the struggle reached the authorities and even fighting alongside them. Now the Tenebrae Lex held all of the secret tunnels that hadn't been destroyed in the battles, allowing them to travel across the hive without exposing themselves to the light. The heretics had developed a fascination with the darkness, where before it had been their duty to bring light. Their tunnels were realms of absolute shadow, where modified kill servitors and half-demonic contraptions lurked, eager to hunt the unwary and the foolish. When the arrival had come, the Tenebrae Lex have cut the power-to-heart blocks that had never seen the light of the sun, plunging vast portions of the hive into an endless night. Then, they had opened their tunnels and let loose their horrors upon the terrified population. Still hundreds of thousands survived in the darkness, clutching increasingly sparse light sources as the monsters drew ever nearer. Most of the killing machines of the Tenebrae Lex had been called back, but such had been the horror and bloodshed that demons manifested, and kept the fear of the mortals aflame to sustain their unholy appetite. The Tenebrae Lex professed to serve the infinite darkness, a force that promised to end the illusion of the sight and bring forth true knowledge through senses better capable of perceiving the divine. Whether it was one of the four that hid beneath that name or a princeling of the warped Decaros had never heard of, the legionary did not know, nor did he much care. The heretics were capable of following orders, and as unnerving as their presence could be, they were far from the most disturbing thing he had ever seen. In return for their services, Decaros gifted the Cabal with the lore of the Forsaken Sun's own warpsmiths, and offered for some of their number to come aboard the Hand of Ruin or the newly acquired demon ships. There they would sail in true, absolute darkness, in the places of the ships that no light had ever seen. There were still kilometers of corridors aboard the flagship that remained unexplored in the aftermath of the Exodus, and the three possessed vessels were entirely new territory, and needed crew to guide the Leviathans within. Though it was difficult to be sure, the tainted tech priest seemed to appreciate the gift, and returned to his peers with the precious data, already sampling it through data ports at the tip of his mechadendrites. Several more leaders came and received their reward. To the priests of mutability, who sought to master the flesh-crafting arts of the former Xenos overlords of the system, Decaros gave relics exhumed from Paraxis Beta. The disciples of Xeonch, whose blue robes hid the changes they had wrought upon themselves, were delighted. They vowed to use the gift to create more abominations to fight for them, and enhance themselves yet further, all for the glory of their dark patron. The prophet in rags, whose true name remained unknown even to Decaros, received a crown of psi-sensitive stone, forged from gems taken from fallen Eldar during the Great Crusade. With it, the rogue Psyker's abilities would increase threefold. The throngs of rabble and the circles of wids he had bound to his will would share his strength. Whether the prophet would be able to withstand the nightmarish visions that had driven several librarians insane before the crown was sealed away in a stasis field, Decaros did not know. It would be an interesting test of the mortal sorcerer's will. The master of the cartel, a gathering of criminal organizations as old as the reconquest of this world, was given the long-lost ring of status of the association's supreme lord. The mind controllers of the puppeteers received one of the alien weapons the sons of Horus had seized long ago, when they had fought alongside the angels of the Ninth and against the so-called Nephilims. Then, at last, came the turn of Valamus Galliard. Valamus, called the Astartes warlord. Come before me. At last, thought the lord of House Galliard. He had watched the others receive their reward, one by one. All the time he had ached to know what was to be his gift, like a child on his birthday's eve. He knew that, for all their vaunted services, none of those who had preceded him on the estrade had brought as much as him to the cause of the Forsaken Sons. None had been more useful to the success of the arrival. His mind was spinning with possibilities, yet there was no denying that he was also possessed by a cold sense of dread. Decaros was even more imposing now than he had been when Valamus had first met him. Proximity with the armored transhuman was filling the human's heart with fear. Perhaps, he thought, unable to stop himself, Decaros intended to end the rewards the same way they had begun. Perhaps even now the spires of Galliard were burning, its members and servants butchered by the blades of the Forsaken Sons. How would he know? He shook himself free of the dark thoughts, and steeled his will. Whatever Decaros' intentions were, there was no way he could stop them now. Even Jar would die in the blink of an eye if the Marines targeted them. All he could do was meet his fate, whatever it would be, with dignity. Tell me, Valamus. What is it you desire? Valamus looked up at his lord, unsure of what to do. This wasn't how it had gone with the others. The others yearned for knowledge, for treasure, for ascension or salvation. But you either already have those things, don't care about them, or can claim them on your own. What can I possibly give you, Valamus, Lord of House Galliard? This time Valamus knew what to say. Opportunity, my lord. Decaros nodded. Yes. Opportunity. The chance to use your power and talents, to do something with all you have. I know all too well the pain of wasted potential, Valamus, and it would be a shame for one such as you to suffer it. And so, here is my gift to you. The final box opened, revealing a scroll of parchment. Valamus took it, and it felt heavier than it should be. Somehow, the Spireborn could feel the weight of destiny in the item, as if whatever was written on it would shape the future of the entire world. These are the Accords of Paraxis, said Decaros, and he was no longer speaking to Valamus alone but addressing the entire room. These are the rules and laws by which all of you and those who serve and obey you shall rule this city and this world once we have purged it from the Loyalists. In our name shall you reign, each of you over your separate domain. And here, in this palace, shall rule a regent, one of your own, chosen by a council of peers, tasked with upholding the accords in the name of Arkan, the true master of this world. The legionary looked at the assembly for a moment, staring at each leader in turn, before continuing. I do not expect you to be comrades. I know all about the grudges and rivalries between you. But you will settle your difference in the frame of these accords, or so I swear by the ruinous powers, the wrath of the Forsaken Sons shall fall upon you and all your followers. Even when we have departed, our ships sailing the storm in search of new prey, do not believe you hidden from my gaze. I shall learn of all that transpires on this world, and punish those who would go against my commandments, through means both subtle and terrible. A table was brought on the estrade by servitors, and on Decaros' indication Valamus unrolled the scroll on it. It was a series of articles, written in a red ink that was unmistakably blood. There was space left at the bottom of the scroll, and it wasn't hard to guess its purpose. One by one the leaders came back, each of them signing the accords with his own blood, or what passed for it. Valamis was the first to sign, cutting his arm with a short knife to provide the liquid. Then he made to return to the assembly, but a gesture from Decaros kept him on the estrade until the end. His 4 escorts joined him, forming a loose protecting circle around him. It is now time to decide who shall be regent. However, this world is still at war, and the one to lead you must be able to protect what we have conquered, as well as have proved his loyalty to us. Valamis here had proved his worth in the past, as have all of you, but it is him we would entrust with this duty and power. Valamis felt his pulse quicken. Visions of what he could do with the powers attributed to the regent and the accords flowed his mind. Is there any amongst you who would contest his nomination, and name a champion to settle this disaccord in the arena of blades? Valamis' blood ran cold, and he cursed himself for a fool. How could he possibly have thought it would be so easy? Decaros had clearly said it, power merely given was worthless. If he wanted to be regent, he would have to prove the 7 other factions' leaders that he could keep this elevated rank. The accords were clear: once named, a regent remained in function until his or her death. The post was both a blessing and a curse, and for a moment Valamis wondered if the wiser move wouldn't be to let any challenger take the throne instead. But he abandoned the idea as soon as it came to him. Certainly it would be better for his life expectations, but showing weakness now would fatally undermine his position in the game of power the accords had just started. He looked back at the 7 other groups Decaros had gathered. All of them had brought muscle with them, but he was fairly certain his bodyguards could take most of them on if needed. The only one that could pose a problem was, "I challenge him," declared Tarox. "I would know the mettle of the forces commanded by the one to stand above us all." "Very well," answered Decaros. "I do not think I need to ask, but who will be your champion?" The renegade captain pointed to the beast at his side, and Decaros chuckled. "Yes, that is what I thought. And you, Valamis? Who will you choose to fight on your behalf?" The Spireborn took a moment to consider his answer. Jar wasn't an option, obviously. The servitor bodyguard wouldn't be able to make full use of its capacities when not actively protecting his master's life. "So, Amelia," he said softly, "you are up." The female assassin walked down the estrade into the circle formed by the rest of the crowd, a respectable distance away from Tarok's champion. If any was surprised by Valamis' choice, they did not show it. All here knew that appearances could be deceiving, and that none of them would have brought a dead weight with them at the gathering. Amelia faced the brute, ridiculously tiny in comparison to the monster. The mutant was growing more and more restless, sensing the imminence of battle but not yet allowed to act. However, Tarox was able to control it. Clearly the renegade captain's ability extended far. The hunger and battle lust in the creature's eyes were almost overpowering, and Valamis thanked the powers that Amelia was immune to almost all psychological weaknesses. The hypno-training that she had followed had cost a lot to Valamis, but the Lord didn't regret his investment. "Begin," said Decaros. It appeared that enough humanity remained in the beast that it could understand the Astartes' words. At once, the mutant hurled itself at the assassin. It was fast, faster than anything of its bulk had any right to be. Seeing it move to tear Amelia to pieces, Valamis could understand why Decaros would go to such lengths as employing his brother's life crafters to ensure the breakers would remain under control. The thought of 100 of these beasts loose without Tarox to keep them directed at the Warband's enemies was unsettling to say the least. But as fast as the mutant was, Amelia was faster. She dodged the claws of the beast by the thinnest of margins, and pointed 2 of her fingers toward it while speaking ancient command words. The rings on the fingers reacted to her order, and an hyper-focused laser beam burst from her left hand, while a stream of almost invisible needles, each loaded with a different poison, that could never be replicated by today's technology, from her right. Both attacks reached their target, and the breaker screamed in agony when the needles tore through its eyes and into its skull and the laser pierced its chest, and burst out of its back. It staggered for a moment, and then collapsed with the sound of a mountain crashing down. There was a moment of silence as the audience watched the fallen corpse of the cornate mutant. Then, Decaros spoke. "A most impressive kill, Lady Amelia. Tarox, as you can see, Valamis does not suffer from a lack of useful servants. Is there anyone else who would contest his claim to regency?" There wasn't, of course. At this point, it was clear to all that Valamus had the Lord of Shadow's favor, and that the duel had only confirmed what the Astartes already knew. They bowed before him, and the gathering began to dissolve. Decaros told Valamus of what he expected from him, to keep Santorius under firm control for now, and prevent any infighting amongst the Forsaken Sun's servants. Troops from the Hand of Ruin were even now being brought down to the hive, to be placed under his command. Not Astartes, obviously. The Forsaken Sons would never take orders from a mere mortal. Men and women taken from the previous system the Warband had conquered and trained in the craft of war in the great ship's chambers. These would form a caste of soldiers who would only be loyal to the regent, and form the base of his rule. Valamus installed his headquarters in what had previously been the governor's own office. He had called his servants back at the house's domain, and ordered his favorite furniture and agents to be immediately relocated. There was a lot of work to do. First of all was choosing who would succeed him as the Galliard Lord. The accords were clear, the regent was technically above the divided factions, and couldn't remain at the head of one. There were many possible candidates, none of which Valamus trusted, but he would have to pick one anyway. Hopefully he would find one smart enough not to ruin all that Valamus had built, but not ambitious enough to seek to replace him as regent. As the first incumbent of that elevated title, it was also Valamus' duty to build the infrastructure of the keep, to use the name now given to the palace, from scratch. Besides the agents he would take with him from his former organization and Decaros' gifted soldiers, he was now in command of tithed warriors and agents from the 7 other factions, all of which were no doubt already plotting his destitution and demise. He had to organize them into an effective policing force, the first step of which would be convincing them that it was better to work for him than against him. He wondered how many would have to die trying to assassinate him for that to happen. The immensity of the task before him was daunting, yet Valamus had never felt happier. The challenge was incredible, and it came with near absolute power over a city of billions. Soon the Forsaken Sons would leave to prosecute the rest of the war, and he would be able to do as he saw fit with the hive. He was still considering what to do immediately when someone in the room caught his attention. "What is wrong, Jar?" The psycho was standing, straighter than Valamus had ever seen him. He was staring at a map of the planet, spreading all over one of the room's walls. It was disturbing to see such intense focus in a man supposed to be struggling to even think because of the chemicals running through his blood. Valamus felt the first shivers of unease begin to penetrate his thoughts. He called again. "Jar? What is wrong?" 6 cities, the psycho whispered. 6 realms of mankind, to be lost to the flames of destiny, to fuel the flames of the infernal forge. Jar was transfixed now, and he continued to ramble, his voice raising ever louder. 1 city for the betrayers, the chosen of the Hydra. 1 for the newborn godlings, the heir of the fallen angels. 1 for the dreaded Black Suns, marked by ruin and hatred. 1 for the Garden Lord, fallen son of the Red World and reborn son of Plague. 1 for the children lost, and returned by their queen. And 1 for the Blood Father, sitting on his throne of skulls. The holographic image lit up. In another room of the keep, locked away and hidden from the new regent's servants, the Lord of Shadows knelt before the one he called his master. "It is done, my lord," said Decaros to the projection of Archon. "Santorius is secure in the hands of our mortal servants." Archon nodded at his subordinate. He seemed distracted, which was only to be expected. The Awakened One was managing at least a dozen different plots at the same time, all of which could be responsible for the Forsaken Sons' victory, or their ignominious defeat. Even his Astartes intellect and not needing to waste time on sleep could only help him so far, and, not for the first time, Decaros feared what would happen if the Lord of the Forsaken Sons were to spread his attention too thinly. "Then marshal our brothers in the capital," told Archon to the Lord of Shadows. "They will need to move soon." "We are moving on to the next phase, then?" "Yes. Arsim has terminated his little errand in Annister, and I believe Karkios will soon be done with fortifying the hive. Once I am done here, I will go take Hector back from his games of carnage. Then we will be ready." A smile as cold as the void appeared on Archon's face, and Decaros shivered as he looked upon the one who held his loyalty. Despite everything he had seen during his sojourn on a world trapped in a warp storm, despite all the horrors he had seen and wrought and the creatures with which he had forged alliances, the smile of the Awakened One still perturbed the legionary. Hive Meridies will fall, and the screams of the people the sons of Kalth have abandoned will echo through the entire planet. and I will make sure that our cousins listen to it." At the command of Arkan, the Forsaken Sons were marching to war. 3 mighty hosts advanced on the coastal hive city of Merides, each hundreds of Astartes strong. One came from the captured capital, and was led by a son of Lorga named Karalit. The self-named Lord of Ash had proved his resourcefulness by surviving Calth, and even if he wasn't a proper member of the Coven, the Dark Apostle's sorceress talents were nothing to scoff at. With this host marched the bulky form of the Steel-wrought, leashed to the will of a group of tech priests through a cocktail of drugs and altered scan returns. The second group had descended straight from the Hand of Ruin, and its members were eager to finally fight on Paraxis. Thousands of mortal troops accompanied them, trained militia from Mula, renegades from Paraxis Beta, and the results of the Fleshmaster's experiments. At the head of this nightmarish host was none other than Arkan himself. The Awakened One had returned from Hive Anister by his personal Thunderhawk, bringing with him the Sorcerer Razum and the Blood Champion. Behind them, approaching Merides from the south, was the army of the Unbound. Lucian, brought back from the brink of death by the craft of the Fleshmasters, led the young Marines. At the front of his horde was the newest creation of Arsim. For now, the demon host appeared normal enough, save for the black smoke rising from his armor's joints. Ever since the Lord of the Coven had bound them together, Aloran and the Shadow of Horus had vied for dominance over their shared body. The rest of the Unbound, even those who had been loyal to the Spireborn, gave the possessed a wide berth. Until they were sure Aloran was back in control, they weren't going to risk being killed in a fit of demonic spite. The armies of the Forsaken Sons were an overwhelming force, far more than what was needed to crush Hive Merides. Once the remaining defenses of the city were broken and its population the Kuldor brought to compliance, the army would be joined by its transports, and pursue its unrelenting advance onto the other continent. There, at last, the renegades would face the weakling sons of Gulaman. The first sign that not all was as planned came in the form of a report from the Hand of Ruin. The storms that obscured the planet from Auspec's scans had cleared for a moment, allowing the ship to scan the city its masters were about to invade. These scans had revealed that the evacuation of Merides was still ongoing. Thousands of vessels, literally every sea craft the Loyalists had found, were forming a giant chain stretching across the ocean, from Merides to Lurkson. Civilians were being herded onto every ship that arrived in the harbor before it returned to the safety of Loyalist-held territory. That spoke of breathtaking control over the subtleties of logistics and crowd control. There was no way a human organization could pull off something like that, not in a hive that had suffered a warp storm for months and was about to be attacked. The second sign was even more obvious. As the Forsaken Sons reached the outskirts of the hive, entirely abandoned as the population massed in the harbor to await evacuation, several of the HARP blocks detonated, raining tons of debris on the advancing columns and rising enough dust to blind even the Astartes sensors. Though the traitor Marines shrugged off the damage before continuing their advance, their mortal slaves died by the hundreds. Only the fear of their masters kept the survivors going forward, that, and the prospect of vengeance. Vehicles were lost in the explosions, whilst others were unable to cross vast gulfs that had doubtlessly been deliberately formed. Minutes later, the first reports over the barely functioning VoxNet confirmed what every warrior of the attack force already knew to be true: the Sons of Calth were here. They have tried to blind me, but I can still see them. Their souls shine bright in my second sight, burning with hatred and nobility in equal measure. Even as I run through the rubble toward them, flying from rock to rock, some part of me that still is a soldier counts them. There are more than 200 of them, standing between us and the innocents they are protecting. We outnumber them 4-1, even without the mortals. They cannot hope to defeat us, no matter what tricks they employ. But even as the bloodthirst rises in me, I know this is not their goal. We were wrong about the Sons of Calth. They haven't abandoned the people of Merides. Instead, they have turned their rescue into a trap for us, where they will be able to harass us and slow us down while the evacuation is complete. Some part of me admires them for such a combination of strategy and humanity. But a far greater part of me hates them for their nobility, and I am still lucid enough to know this hatred is born of envy. Even before the heresy, we were never that noble or that resourceful. You were as you are now. The children of the blood god, marked by his hand and killing in his name. I burst out of a cloud of dust and amongst them 3 warriors in cobalt and jade, who fire at me as soon as they see me. They know me for what I am. The Sons of Calth have all seemed possessed in battle before. Their long-range weapons, fired at such proximity, pierce through my warped armor, and one of the projectile tears a hole through my left wing. Blood flows from both wounds, and I laugh. It has been a long time since I last bled in combat. My axe swings and cuts a legionary apart, showering us all in gore. It has been a long time since I killed a brother Space Marine too. Hecaran roars in pleasure and I roar too, sending my remaining foes tumbling back. I can feel the gaze of the blood god from the skies, just as I hear the laughter of Hecaran's kin. They crave the blood being shed, the pain and sacrifice of the grandest souls. On the opposite edge of the city, the mass of humanity is drawing countless lesser spirits, but it is here, on this field of battle where demigods wage war, that the true scions of the warp gather. My opponents have drawn their own blades, and are moving to encircle me. They know that to turn their back to me would mean certain death, as opposed to the mere near certainty of it now that they face me. I batter the sword of the first aside with my left hand, the claws resisting the bit of its adamantium teeth with unnatural ease. My axe takes his skull off his shoulders in the next breath, and in the same moment his comrade rams his own weapon into the back of my right knee. I screams in anger and turns to face him with a flap of my wings, and the shaft of my axe crashes against his armor. He falls to the ground and me on my knees, but while I am merely waiting for the wound he inflicted to heal, my enemy will not get up again. I heard the crush of his spine when I hit him, an improbable result, but warp-touched weapons have a way of tweaking the odds to their whims. Despite his injury, the cripple yet lives, and I can feel the hate and contempt in his gaze as he looks upon me. I lift my axe to deliver the final blow and give this worthy foe a warrior's death, and then the world around me explodes. Too late, I realize that they brought me here, and the charges buried under the ground detonate. As tons of rockreet begin to bury me, and the rage threatens to overtake me entirely, the only thing I can think of is this: after Armatura, I cannot believe that any son of Angron fell for that trick again. Domarion had no idea what Arkan was thinking as they struggled to cross the rubble created by the Loyalists' trap. If the Lord of the Forsaken Sons was angered by the Sons of Kalth's defiance, he showed no sign of it, simply moving forward with all the speed he could force his Terminator armor to. They were spearheading the advance of their forces, tearing a path for the rest of the legionaries and the mortal auxiliaries to follow. The enemy was giving ground, falling back while firing disciplined volleys at the renegades' ranks. They weren't retreating, they were drawing the Forsaken Sons wherever they wanted them to be. That much was obvious to Domarion, and thus it had to be to Arkan. And yet, in such conditions, it was better to walk forward in a trap than to wander aimlessly, or worse, turn back and retreat. The other groups, with which all but the most intermittent contact had been lost, would also be pressing forward in order to reach the port. The Sons of Kalth wanted to protect the civilians, therefore, all the attackers had to do to find them was to get to the mortals. Besides, with no way to contact Arkan, none of the sub-leaders would risk being the only one falling back. All Domarion could do for now was keep pace with his lord and protect him from whatever else Gulamanskit had planned. He and the rest of Arkan's bodyguards, a group of 7 Terminators in all, wearing black armor and carrying the best weapons Mercurian had been able to forge or restore, formed a loose circle around their liege. All of them were sons of Horus, a fact that had rattled more than one of the Forsaken Sons. To end this grief, Domarion had allowed anyone who beat one of the bodyguards in the training chambers to take the place of the one they had defeated. Since that rule had been installed, shortly after their depart from Mula, there had been 52 such challenges, 6 of which had been directed at Domarion himself. All of the original members of the group still held their positions. It did not mean that they were the best fighters of the Warband. Even Domarion had to admit, in the privacy of his own thoughts, that they were a few of the Forsaken Sons who could defeat him in single combat. But most such skilled individuals were leaders of men, and the Warband needed leadership more than bodyguards. If nothing else, their own ambition prevented them from seeking a place amongst Arkan's guardians. Still, all of the current guards were champions in their own right, who could have led their own pack had they chosen to. It fell to Domarion to direct them so that they would remain focused on the Awakened One's protection. At this moment, Arkan was communicating with the Hand of Ruin, whose emitters and sensors were the only thing capable of opening a stable Vox link in this situation. "No," he grunted to whoever he was talking to. "You can't try to bombard the harbor. In these conditions, you are just as likely to hit us." There was a short pause while he listened to the answer. I don't care how good our gunners are. This is a world drowning in the warp, teetering on the brink of full-scale demonic incursion. Why do you think I didn't order you to flatten the other hives from orbit in the first place? Just tell the other commanders to keep advancing east and rendezvous with us there. We will take care of this mess here on the ground. He shut down the Vox link and turned to Damarian, who was walking to his right. Unlike the chief of his bodyguards, Arkan appeared to be bareheaded, his bald and scarred skull seemingly exposed but the slight shimmering of the force field surrounding it. "Where is the Blood Champion?" asked the Lord of the Forsaken Sons. "Gone," answered Damarian. "He went ahead of the rest of us, with these wings of his." As soon as he had finished speaking, another explosion shook the ground. A scream of demonic fury and dismay pierced the ears of the attackers, and the march faltered as the implications of that scream sank in. Arkan turned his attention back toward the general direction of their foes, his expression still as unreadable as stone. "Forward!" he shouted, his voice booming over the background noise of a murdered city. "Bring me the skulls of Gulaman's bastard sons." The legionaries and mortal auxiliaries following in the Terminator's wake roared back at their lord, and kept advancing with renewed vigor. Karalit and his men were, to the leader's increasing wrath, not advancing at all. The sons of Kalth, and by the blood of the dark gods, how he loathed that name, had pinned them in place. More than 300 Marines were blocked by the collapsed buildings, and the loyalist sharpshooters were taking down all those who tried to climb the obstacles. How in the most holy name of the Pantheon were they managing it in the dust? Karalit did not know. Perhaps the faithless dogs of the Mechonicus had managed to create a new version of the Astartes power armor, capable of piercing the dust clouds. Several of the warriors entrusted to him by Arkan already lay dead, several others were incapacitated, and they hadn't so much as seen their enemy. When he had received his command from the Awakened One, Karalit had seen it as a sign of the gods, a chance to impress them and prove his worth to Arkan. The son of Horus shone with the favor of the greater powers, and Karalit, just elevated to his circle of lieutenants, was going to fail at fulfilling his objectives. The shame of it burned in his soul, and he wanted nothing more than to rip apart those pathetic shade of a dead world with his bare hands. He couldn't reach most of his troops, preventing him from ordering a massive, coordinated charge that the loyalist snipers would have been powerless to stop. His sorcery was being blocked. A group of librarians were combining forces to single out psychically active minds and cut them off from the warp. While it meant that the Sons of Kalth were dedicating a huge amount of resources to saving the miserable humans, all that mattered to Karalit was that he couldn't call upon the bargains he had made with the Empyrean's denizens. So his only option was to do something he had really hoped he wouldn't have to do. He turned to the tech priests who had followed the host since Santorius. He could see the power of the warp stream through their bodies, though they were as candles compared to the raging inferno of Mercurian's own ascended being. Sometimes, Karalit wondered just what the adepts of the Dark Mechanicum would turn into at the end of their journey to illumination. All those who sought the wisdom and power of the gods were changed by the trials and blessings of the ruinous powers, and often, even those who did not seek them. "Unleash the steel wrought," he commanded them. For a long time, he had slumbered. Pain and anger had been taken from him, replaced by a cold numbness of his senses as well as of his mind. He had not dreamed, lost in utter blackness and sensory deprivation. His thoughts had been halted, letting him experience something more akin to death than to any kind of sleep mortals and immortals could enjoy. But no more, though he did not know why. Now he was awake once more, and with awareness the memory of pain and the flood of fury had returned. He hungered for vengeance against those who had hurt him, who had broken his flesh and he couldn't remember. He was still dizzy, and his memories were blurred. He couldn't remember his name, but he did not need to. He could see his enemies through the dust of the city they had murdered, their armor red and emblazoned with blasphemous markings. Looking at them filled his heart with hatred. How many innocents had died when they had collapsed these buildings, all to trap him and his loyal allies? Thousands? Millions? But they would pay for that. He advanced on them, their fire ricocheting on his armor. In response, he lifted his left arm, and unleashed a wave of burning promethium at the traitors. Promethium? How could he do that? Hadn't it been a bolter the last time he had fought against those who had turned against the God Emperor? He couldn't remember, but it did not matter. All that mattered was that the traitors burned and died, cooked in their armors, screaming to their dark gods for aid even as they finally perished. It was a good death for heretic like them, May their souls burn forevermore in whatever hell awaited their worthless shades. The others were retreating before him, but he would not let them flee. He was retribution incarnate, a ghost kept from his rightful repose and tasked with the destruction of all traitors. None would escape from him. "Run as much as you want, traitors," he shouted at them through the speakers atop his metallic body. "I will still kill you all." The monstrosity of steel and adamantium screamed something inarticulate at them, but Librarian Nemeus didn't need to understand the words to feel the emotion behind the horrifying sound. Hatred and pain radiated from it like heat from a sun. This was nothing unexpected from a servant of the ruinous powers, let alone one entombed into the profaned coffin of a dreadnought. And yet, Nemeus felt something at odds with what his eyes were telling him. On the outside, the creature that was tearing through his brothers appeared much like the other renegade dreadnoughts he had faced during the Shadow Crusade in Ultramar. Few warriors of the World Eaters were ever interred, and the 12th Legion's engines had seemed normal enough, beyond the fevered madness caused by the crude implants set in their brain. His current enemy was much more like those ancients of the 17th Legion Nemeus had seen. It was painted in black and gold, and the machine's head-like bunch of scanners and augers were shaped in the form of a demon's skull, with a circle of chains sculpted around it like a loose collar. Corrupt blood and other foul humors dripped from its massive arms, and the fire projected by its left was purple and unnatural, eating through ceramite with ease and howling with Neverborn's cries. Here was no pure union of flesh and metal, but a corruption of both through the madness of the warp. And yet, he could feel no taint from the hellish machine, only bottomless pain and fury. Something was terribly wrong here, and Nemeus suspected he knew what. The mere thought of what the Forsaken Sons may have done made his blood run cold, but it also opened new possibilities and ways of action. Standing atop what had once been a 40-story building, far enough to be sure that no enemy would take a shot at him, the librarian lifted his staff, closed his eyes, and projected his mind within that of the dreadnought's host. His brothers in the circle, back at the hive's port, sensed his coming and let him pass into the sea of souls. Brushing aside the tendrils of demonic energy reaching for his soul, he focused his sixth sense on the dreadnought's soul and established a telepathic link. As always, his transhuman mind struggled to express the inside of the host's mind in a fashion he could understand. The dreadnought's occupant, however, was a soul far more troubled than any he had ever met. When his surroundings became stable again, he was shocked by how his subconscious had chosen to express what his powers had found. It was as he had thought. Here was a soul that was as loyal as any of his brothers, bound into slavery by invasive technology and the blackest of sorceries. Veil after veil of deceit had been placed upon its eyes, and it was kept half comatose by drugs flooding through the pitiful remnants of its flesh. For the man trapped within the machine, the sons of Kalth were the traitors, appearing to him as word-bearers bearing the debased insignia of chaos corruption, while the Forsaken Sons were perceived as ultramarines themselves. And the interred soul was too weak to realize the deception. This was a blasphemy such as Nemeus found it hard to believe any legionary would ever allow, even one who had fallen so far as to betray his oath to the Emperor. Yet the evidence was there, plain to see with his mind's eye. As Nemeus felt the state of the host's body, he was appalled at the desecration that had taken place. Not only had the traitors placed a human inside a dreadnought chassis, something that was considered impossible, for no human mind and body could endure the strain of half immortality, but they had reduced the poor soul to his most basic biological component. Only a brain and an attached spinal cord floated in the walker's sarcophagus, kept alive by the warp energy alimenting the machine. While most of the brain was nude, the bones of its skull stripped off to allow cables and needles to be inserted into the grey matter, the right side of the cortex was covered in silver metal, the color of which Nemeus could perceive even with his sixth sense. He recognized it, though he wondered how a human had come to receive an augmentation from the 10th Legion, and then fallen into the traitor's hands. The augmetic was how the human was capable of controlling the dreadnought, even in his half-aware state. Its Medusan technology, something that not even the tech lords of Mars had ever been able to study, was enhancing his reflexes and connection to the machine spirit of the engine, twisted and corrupted as it was. He didn't have long. Soon, the demon engine would detect his intrusion, and shield its host's mind against his touch. Yet as he looked upon the tortured spark of life of the man trapped within, he realized that he couldn't simply kill him and free him from his torment. Wards had been placed around his brain, intended to protect the flesh component of the machine from being consumed by its etheric aspects, but also effectively blocking any brutal psychic assault. As much as Nemeus was repulsed at leaving the poor wretch to his fate, all that the librarian could do was punish those who held the leash. He looked for the connection, the link that bound the dreadnought to those controlling it, maintaining the veil of lies upon the man's mind. Three beings were keeping the being, the steel-wrought. He heard the name spoken in demonic whispers at the edge of his perception, under their control. They weren't far, for they had to be. The stream of data received by the dreadnought was constantly transmitted to them and altered by their own cogitators before being sent back to the deceived spirit within. If there was anything human remaining with their corrupted shells of metal, Nemeus couldn't detect it and didn't care. With a psychic roar that cast never-born spirits away from his prone body in a radius of several dozens meters, he sent a wave of purifying fire down the link, feeling a bit of indication in the destruction of these slavers, even if he couldn't free the slave. Karalit watched and laughed as the steel-wrought tore into the enemy lines. There was something deeply satisfying into seeing the servants of the false emperor fighting amongst themselves, each side believing the other to be heretical and treacherous. Even with his connection to the warp stunted, the Dark Apostle could feel the approval of the gods as they looked upon what had become of Mueller Prime's governor. In a glorious instant, the Lord of Ash had a vision of the whole Imperium torn apart by civil wars, butchering loyal citizens by billions for imaginary crimes against the false emperor, while the dark gods laughed in the heavens at the results of mankind's ignorance. He knew then that in the millennia to come, whether by the influence of chaos or not, the empire of humanity would be fighting itself as often as any of its other, countless foes. That would, in time, be its undoing, and allow the chosen of the Pantheon to rise from its ashes to rule forever in the material realm. Karalit's pleasant vision was interrupted when, all of a sudden, a dreadnought stopped its advance. The commander turned to the tech priests, ready to castigate them, but froze as he saw them. Blue warp fire ran on their limbs and in their bodies, destroying everything it touched until the trio of adepts collapsed on the ground as charred husks. Psychic intrusion. Someone of not inconsiderable power and skill had stopped the steel-wrought and destroyed its handlers. Karalit quickly turned back his gaze to the machine, half thinking that it would turn on them now that those who deceived its senses were gone. But his worries appeared to be unfounded, for the dreadnought simply remained still, despite lacking any trace of damage grave enough to have deactivated it. Deciding to wonder about it later, the Dark Apostle lifted his croziers high and charged, singing prayers to the dark gods, his guards surrounding him and the rest of his army quickly following. The line of the sons of Kalth was broken, their ranks still in disarray. Now was the time to use the opportunity the steel-wrought had offered them. "Blood for the gods!" he shouted, and the battle cry was taken up by the troops following him. "Death to the false emperor!" To the ignorant, an army may seem to be nothing more than a gathering of warriors, pointed in the direction of the enemy and ordered to kill until either them or the foe lay dead. In that interpretation, war was nothing more than the cold application of mathematics, with troops superior both in number and quality crushing all opposition under the sheer strength of their forces. That was how war happened in war stories, anyway, something Lucian had once enjoyed reading, if only because it was one of the few things that could make him laugh. But, of course, as with so many other things, remembrancers, at least those who had never seen war from any closer than a ship in orbit, had gotten it all wrong. The truth was that an army was much, much more than the mere sum of its components. It was similar to a living creature. The cells that composed it could, together, accomplish things far beyond what they could have done alone. What enabled them to do so was the ability to exchange information between themselves, so as to act in a common effort. But now, the Forsaken Sons had lost that ability. The Sons of Kalth had effectively cut each of the assault groups from the others, and even amongst each group, communication was problematic. Not only had the Vox and the visibility been disabled by the dust, telepathy was similarly blocked. The members of the Coven dispatched to each group unable to synchronize in the ether to fight off the loyalist librarians efficiently. In those conditions, the Sons of Kalth stood a very realistic chance of annihilating the attackers. If they focused on each group in turn, using their apparent ability to see through the dust clouds, they could slowly erode the Forsaken Sons' numbers, and considering how many warriors the Awakened One had committed to the assault on Merides, this could very well cost the Warband the war for Paraxis. Lucian admired the cunning behind the trap. It was, as he was sure others amongst the Forsaken Sons had noticed, the perfect union of idealism and practicality, striking a blow against a foe while buying time for those they had pledged to save. Mercy and devotion, combined with the ruthlessness needed to destroy the very city they protected. The dust alone would kill hundreds of unprotected mortal slaves, choking them to death without the Loyalists needing to use a single bolt. Yes, it was a great plan. Against any other foe, it may even have worked. But the Forsaken Sons had trump cards that their enemies could hardly be blamed for not including in their theoreticals. With a feral smile, Lucian turned to the one that had been placed with his group. As always, the sight of the creature sent a wave of unease through his veins, which in turn caused his armor to pump a new dose of stims into his bloodstream. Learning the truth about the creature, both its mortal and immortal one, had only increased the feeling, but he had to admit that the demon host was impressive to look upon, at the very least. Now they would see what it could do on the battlefield. "Aloran," he called, his voice easily picked up by the possessed's supernatural senses. The answer came as a whisper in his thoughts, dripping with impatience and unspoken promises of suffering and bloodshed. Merely communicating with the creature filled Lucian's mind with images of slaughter and ruin. "Yes?" "Kill them," he managed to say, feeling blood begin to trickle to his lips from his nose. "Kill them all. They shall know no fear." These words had first been spoken by the Emperor himself, then repeated by the Primarch Robute Gulaman upon his publication of the Codex Astartes. They were more than a platitude, or a metaphor. Space Marines were literally fearless, at least in the sense mortals understood it. They were genetically engineered killing machines, and cowardice was bred out of them during their ascension. Yet they could still feel concern for their own lives, and those of their comrades. Reckless fools would, after all, made poor soldiers. Duty was the anchor of a Space Marine's violent existence, around which their entire psychological landscape was built. And it was in failing of that duty that the loyalist Astartes could experience dread again. During the heresy, Astartes had known fear when their brothers had turned against them, seemingly driven mad and threatening the ideals for which they had all fought and bled. Those remaining loyal amongst the traitor legions had known fear as they lost the trust and brotherhood of their kindred, and the traitors had known it when the siege had failed or when they had been forced to face their own demons. As the galaxy burned in the fires lit by Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's words had been proven untrue. The Neverborn had drunk on that fear like a rare wine, feasting on the strength of that most potent emotion. And few had drunk as much of it as the creature that would come to call itself the Shadow of Horus. The first thing that the Sons of Calth felt was the unnatural cold. Despite their power armor, they all felt it bite into their flesh. Then, their enhanced helm augers, designed by a tech priest allied with their chapter during the scouring, began to scramble. They heard the screams of the damned and static filled their vision before abruptly clearing, revealing a vistas known to all warriors of the chapter, Calth. Not the Calth that was, the verdant paradise that shone with the promise of a glorious future. The Loyalists were looking at the ruined hellscape of the world which name they bore in stunned disbelief. The skies burned with the sickly light of a poisoned star. For miles in every direction, there was naught but scorched, radioactive ground and the remnants of the armies slain in this conflict that had murdered this world and almost destroyed the 13th Legion. And there, before the translocated warriors, stood a figure clad in shadow and black flame. The creature wore an Astartes battle plate, its emblems invisible beneath the bones and spikes that rose from its distorted shape. Yet it was clear that this was no son of a Primarch. Smoke rose from the joints, forming screaming, terrified faces. Its hands ended in long, scythed claws that burned with the same unholy fire that shone in the creature's eyes. Its face was a helm, sealed into the rest of the armor, but that appeared to be made of a flowing black metal that took the aspect of a living visage, one that all the Sons of Calth knew very well. It was that of Horus Lupercal, War Master of the Imperium, Arch-Betrayer and Chosen of Chaos. Confronted with this shade, the Space Marines froze only for a moment. They had seen and fought many demons and their second-born kin during the heresy, and only this one's unusual appearance put them off. But that moment was all the possessed needed. Moving with impossible speed, it cut a first Loyalist in two with a single sweep of its talons, before ripping out the innards of a second. As it killed, the handsome mask twisted into a demonic figure with a fanged mouth that never closed and howled at its foes. The sound was that of 1,000 dying screams. To some of the Sons of Calth, it seemed that there was another voice beneath the ghostly echoes, one that screamed not in agony, but helpless fury and despair. 3 warriors charged the abomination, but they died when it turned its head toward them and vomited a stream of black fire. The demon laughed as it kept killing, feeding on the death cries of its victims and their rising sense of powerlessness. The memories brought back by the illusion of Calth, the face of Horus, the slaughter of their brothers, this was starting to make them doubt they could win this battle. And then, one warrior struck it. He bore the mark of a sergeant on his armor, and carried a chainsword decorated with purity seals that had been given to him by the planet's cardinal Tranos. His name was written on his shoulder guard, Karl of the Sons of Calth, once a battle brother of the 247th Company of the 13th Legion. His blow did little more than scar the armor of the beast, yet it drew its attention to him. Faced with the visage of Horus Lupercal and a creature that had killed 10 of his brothers in as many heartbeats, the veteran held his ground in defiance. That, more than anything, seemed to annoy the demon. It spoke, its voice a chorus of the damned. A good effort, son of Gulaman, but that's all you get. We will see about that now, won't we? Answered Karl, his blade held up at the demon's flowing visage. Too quick for the eye to follow, the second-born moved on the sergeant. It batted the chainsword away, though its hand hissed where it came in contact with the weapon's purity seals. With its left hand, it lifted Karl up, holding the veteran at the same level than its own face, and spoke once more, its tone filled with arrogance and the promise of pain. I am the shadow of the arch-traitor, little man. I am the fear of a billion souls given form, brought together by the tides of the sea of souls and incarnated by the sorcery of one who could end you with a thought. I am. The demon was interrupted by the impact of the son of Calth's fist on its mouth. Fangs broke under the shock, their fragments dissolving into nothingness before they touched the ground. The creature staggered back, letting the loyalist escape from its grasp. He picked up his fallen blade, pressed the activation rune, and threw himself at the abomination before him. You ask nothing, shouted the son of Calth, adding a new word at the top of his lungs for every wound he inflicted. His first blow cut a deep scar into the possessed's torso. His second severed 3 of the claws of its right hand. His third pierced right through it and burst from its back, splattering black ichor on the rubble beneath. The shadow of Horus screamed in pain and outrage. It pushed the loyalist away, tearing the blade free from its chest as it did so. Already the wound was healing, but the black flames that surrounded the beast were growing dimmer. It was getting weaker, and the sons of Calth could all see it. More than the blade, the warrior's dismissal of its power had hurt it. Neverborn were creatures of symbolism and emotions, and this one was made of fear and the image of the traitor warmaster. Faced with the denial of the son of Calth and his absence of fear, it was weakened. You are failure, said the same warrior that had wounded the demon host. If there is even a shred of truth in your claims, if you truly were born from the remnants of Horus' dark soul, then you are the ghost of a man who failed in everything. In his honor. In his duty. And even in his betrayal. The scenery of Calth began to blur as the demon's hold over its power faded, denied by courage and honor. The other loyalists gathered around their enemy, blades held high. They had learned long ago that bolts were ineffective against the Neverborn, but that the sword, a weapon whose symbolism came from the first days of mankind, was capable of hurting the creatures. Together, they struck once more. The demon blocked or dodged all of the blows but one, roaring in anger and casting away its would-be slayers. But the blow that reached it was the most telling of all. Kar's sword pierced deep into the creature's breastplate once more, right where it had done so but a few seconds before. The fiend screamed as its control over its host weakened. The mirage of Calth vanished, and this time it was mortal blood that spilled onto the stones, tainted as it may be. The black fire that surrounded it receded and, with a disgustingly organic sound, the traitor's armor returned to a classic Mark IV pattern instead of the twisted abomination it had been under the spirit's influence. Holding his wound closed with his hands, the renegade, now once more in control of his flesh, stumbled backward. His helm was gone, and as he locked gaze with Cal, the son of Calth saw a face that may have once been regal, but was now distorted by pain, tics and hatred. He tried to speak, but only blood left his mouth. Then he fell, vanishing at the bottom of the pile of rubble where the creature in his soul had fought against the loyalist sergeant. Cal took a moment to catch his breath, before calling for a retreat. Already the Forsaken Sons were advancing, ready to crush the sons of Calth while they were still exposed from the battle against the demon. As his brothers fell back in precise formation, a signal passed through the Vox channels, and Karl smiled, for he knew that the trap had been sprung. All that remained was for them to do their duty and delay the traitors once they turned course, having learned of what had just happened. It happened all at once. One moment they were pursuing the sons of Calth, the next they had turned back to face them. One moment all they could see were 20 or so legionaries in front of them, which they outnumbered 10 to 1 without the mortals. The next, the group of Terminators had been isolated from the rest of its group by a cordon of dozens of loyalists, and surrounded by yet more of them. A perfect ambush, and one they hadn't even seen coming, so lost they had been in the prospect of spilling the blood of Guilliman's sons. Its purpose was obvious, to kill Arkan. Without their leader, the Forsaken Sons would most probably collapse into warring factions. The unity they had been able to maintain through their bonds of brotherhood forged in the Exodus would not endure long without the authority of the Awakened One. Which meant that, as Arkan's chief bodyguard, it was Demarian's duty to ensure his lord's survival. Without asking for permission, he activated his armor's Vox beacon, establishing a liaison with the Hand of Ruin. Within seconds, the trusty mechanisms of his battle plate had awakened the link, and he gave his orders to the one mortal he needed to hear them. "Perseus, we are being ambushed by the sons of Calth. Get here with the Thunderhawk, now." There was the briefest reply of acknowledgement, and the link shut off. The Terminator refocused his attention on the battlefield, ready to kill anyone who dared to threaten his lord. It was then that he saw him, emerging from the clouds of dust like the ghost of an ancient age. The breath of the former captain of the Sons of Horus was taken at the sight. The newcomer's armor was as covered in dust as that of the rest of them, but his colors were clearly visible. The sapphire and emerald of the Sons of Calth seemed elevated by the dirt instead of diminished by it. His helm was fashioned in the aspect of a golden mask, whose kingly face looked upon the Forsaken Sons with righteous fury. Like them, his armor was a cataphractii model, yet he moved with a speed and grace that belied its weight. In his right hand he carried a power sword of exquisite craftsmanship, its silver blade kept clean by the crackling energy field surrounding it. In his left, he bore a shield the size of an Astartes boarding shield, but which appeared no bigger than a buckler in the giant's hands. His shoulder pads wore the emblem of his company, the third of that Ultramarines offshoot, and the mark that Demarian knew meant here was the champion of the division. His name was also written in golden letters on his chest, Theseus. The ore faded, and Demarian felt hatred course in his veins instead. He wanted nothing more than to face this paladin of false ideals and the lies of a hateful tyrant, but he knew he couldn't. The champion had clearly come to confront Arkan, and beyond all considerations of honor and respect, it was Demarian's duty to ensure that no one would interfere with the duel. After all, he doubted the loyalists had engineered this whole elaborate trap just to rely on the result of a one-on-one battle. The Lord of the Forsaken Sons and the champion of murdered Calth clashed together in silence, with no pre-battle taunts, threats nor any declaration. Arkan was wielding a pair of lightning claws, and there was nothing elegant or subtle in how the Awakened One fought. Efficiency was all that mattered to him, and he was only more dangerous for it. As their escorts collided and began to battle, the two Astartes began their own duel. Theseus blocked most of Arkan's blows with his shield, and deflected the others with his sword, while the traitor warlord turned away the loyalists' strike with his blades. Despite the armor they wore, both warriors did all they could to avoid putting it to the test, partly because of pride, mostly because their foe wielded weapons that could truly damage them. The duel lasted a full minute before the first blow being struck. One of Arkan's claws passed through Theseus' guard, pointed directly at his face. The loyalist dodged at the last second, but the energized talon tore through the side of the golden mask, and into the flesh beneath. A few drops of blood were spilt before the field surrounding the weapon cauterized the wound. "First blood to me," Arkan declared calmly. "Last blood is all that matter, traitor," spat back the son of Calth, his voice thick with hatred. "I will avenge Chapter Master Veros." "Your lord died screaming, little angel," declared the Awakened One, still utterly calm. "His soul yet burns in the claws of 1,000 demons. Soon, you will join him, as will all other scions of your pathetic chapter. We will defeat you, traitor." "No," said Arkan softly, lifting up his claws for another round. "You will not." In the wake of Aloran's fall, Lucian ordered the Unbound to advance. Despite his ultimate defeat, the Possessed had succeeded in breaking the enemy lines, and it was vital they kept their momentum. 200 Astartes were running toward an enemy not even a quarter of their strength, but the charge was taking its toll. Malone had already lost 3 pack members, one of which he was sure wouldn't get back up again. The Sons of Kalth were retreating before them, but it was the very opposite of a rout. They were falling back to pre-planned position, and shooting at the Unbound from prepared gun emplacements. Sometimes one of them would be too slow, or an Unbound faster or luckier than expected, and they would get one of them. But if the rate of attrition was as bad as Malone suspected, there wouldn't be any Unbound left alive by the time they reached the awakened one. Damn the Loyalists for using such underhanded tactics, thought the young Astartes. And damn us for falling for them. But it was impossible to stop the charge, now. Too many Unbound were lost to the battle, stimulants flowing into their altered flesh. Malone didn't doubt Lucian was cursing the Fleshmaster's innovations as much as he was. And yet, they had to reinforce Arkan, and a slow, methodical advance would never see them reach his position in time to matter. Cursing loudly in a dozen languages he had never needed to speak aloud before, Malone kept running and shooting ahead. Life aboard the Hand of Ruin had changed much of the mortal servants of the Forsaken Sons in the aftermath of the Mueller campaign. In the time between the end of the Exodus and the Warband's first war, those few who had survived the nightmarish journey had grown used to the ship's emptiness. Of a crew of thousands, barely a few hundreds had remained. They had owed their survival as much to their own skills as to their master's protection, and were all valuable, trained crew. The Astartes vessel had been a place of quiet calm and order, where every soul was required to tend to the great machine's many needs. That wasn't the case anymore. Now the ship was teeming with life, and corruption spread amongst the weak at an impressive rate. Terrified slaves taken from Mueller's hive cities, who had clung to golden aquilers and prayed to the Emperor as they were dragged on board, now paid homage to the eightfold pantheon by sacrificing their own. Mutation was rife, and creatures that weren't never born yet weren't human either stalked the darkest corridors, hungering for prey. Even the most ordered rabble was still far below the usual standard of discipline on Legion vessels. Things had become more relaxed since they had turned against Terra, of course, but the degeneration had been less marked aboard the Hand of Ruin than many other Sons of Horus ships. Now, some of the riches taken were no better than the chattel gathered by the word-bearers and used as bolter fodder during the heresy. On a sentimental level, this was a blow to the old crew's dignity. On a much more practical level, it also put their physical safety at risk. The Sons of Kalth were retreating before them, but it was the very opposite of a rout. They were falling back to pre-planned position, and shooting at the Unbound from prepared gun emplacements. Sometimes one of them would be too slow, or an Unbound faster or luckier than expected, and they would get one of them. But if the rate of attrition was as bad as Malone suspected, there wouldn't be any Unbound left alive by the time they reached the awakened one. Damn the Loyalists for using such underhanded tactics, thought the young Astartes. And damn us for falling for them. But it was impossible to stop the charge, now. Too many Unbound were lost to the battle, stimulants flowing into their altered flesh. Malone didn't doubt Lucian was cursing the Fleshmaster's innovations as much as he was. And yet, they had to reinforce Arkan, and a slow, methodical advance would never see them reach his position in time to matter. Cursing loudly in a dozen languages he had never needed to speak aloud before, Malone kept running and shooting ahead. Life aboard the Hand of Ruin had changed much of the mortal servants of the Forsaken Sons in the aftermath of the Mueller campaign. In the time between the end of the Exodus and the Warband's first war, those few who had survived the nightmarish journey had grown used to the ship's emptiness. Of a crew of thousands, barely a few hundreds had remained. They had owed their survival as much to their own skills as to their master's protection, and were all valuable, trained crew. The Astartes vessel had been a place of quiet calm and order, where every soul was required to tend to the great machine's many needs. That wasn't the case anymore. Now the ship was teeming with life, and corruption spread amongst the weak at an impressive rate. Terrified slaves taken from Mueller's hive cities, who had clung to golden aquilers and prayed to the Emperor as they were dragged on board, now paid homage to the eightfold pantheon by sacrificing their own. Mutation was rife, and creatures that weren't never born yet weren't human either stalked the darkest corridors, hungering for prey. Even the most ordered rabble was still far below the usual standard of discipline on Legion vessels. Things had become more relaxed since they had turned against Terra, of course, but the degeneration had been less marked aboard the Hand of Ruin than many other Sons of Horus ships. Now, some of the riches taken were no better than the chattel gathered by the word-bearers and used as bolter fodder during the heresy. On a sentimental level, this was a blow to the old crew's dignity. On a much more practical level, it also put their physical safety at risk. Asim was still weakened from binding the shadow of Horus to Aloran's soul. Had he been at his best, he could have torn through the Sons of Kalth's barrier, or at least reach out to the other Psykers deployed across the invading forces. Together, they would have been able to oppose the Loyalists' focused power and allow their forces access to the warp once more. It was humiliating to be denied his own powers like that, especially on a world so deep in the Sea of Souls. Power ran all around him, yet as it was, all he could do was block the bolts aimed at him and quicken his reactions through what little energy he could gather to him. From a purely academic point of view, the spell of the Sons of Guilliman was fascinating. From a practical one, it could very well kill him if he wasn't careful and dragged the full attention of its makers to him. He could feel them even now, a circle of bright minds at the other side of the city, scrying the ruins their kindred had created for the first sign of psychic activity. It was as if a giant web had been spread on the hive, and to tug at it would bring the attention of the circle to the unlucky practitioner like some monstrous spider. With no way to synchronize, the Forsaken Sons' own psychically gifted couldn't act against the Loyalists. Very clever indeed. A pack of warriors had formed around him, though he had not asked for such protection. He supposed none of the 6 Iron Warriors wanted to explain to Arkan that the leader of the Coven had taken a bolt to his skull while they were nearby. Or perhaps Arkan had given them orders to do so, knowing the sorcerer would be diminished after his recent ordeal. It burned his pride that the former commander of the Sons of Horus would think he needed to be protected. It burned him even more to know that the Awakened One, if he had indeed given that order, had been right. He and his escorts were advancing behind Arkan, amongst the throng of human slaves. The souls of the mortals were weak flames to his psychic sense, but with so many of them gathered and their thoughts aligned toward one purpose, he couldn't help but feel their emotions. Fear, hatred, bloodlust, the raw, savage, mindless joy of battle. As all mobs were wont to do, they reminded Asim of one giant, dumb animal, some beast of burden that the Forsaken Sons could guide toward their foes by appealing to its basest instincts. In truth, the trap of the Sons of Kalth had made the mortals all but useless. They saw even less than the legionaries and struggled to keep up with their master's advance. Now that they were being attacked instead of pursuing a retreating foe, however, the massive bodies at least provided some cover, and their wildfire would perhaps pin the Loyalists in place. You don't need to rely on them. If you would but accept my offer, you could rip apart the souls of these petty librarians, and then nothing would protect these fools from your might. The voice came from a demonic visage reflected in the pool of blood and gore formed by the gruesome remains of a dozen butchered cultists. Asim ignored the voice, like he had since the battle had begun and necessity had demanded he deactivated the visual filters he had used. You are weakened, Father, and you have fallen into your enemy's trap. How many of your brothers will die in the time it will take to force back the anathema's slaves? What if Arkan falls here because you didn't accept my offer? Without him, all of you will die in vain, without accomplishing a fraction of what you could have achieved. And it will all be your fault, Father. That was it. Asim snarled mentally at the demon, and let his mental voice express his sentiments while head-shooting a Son of Kalth with a single psychically guided shot. And whose fault is it that I am not at my full power now? Do not think me blind to your manipulations, Herald. You made me use my strength in bringing Aloran into the ranks of the Secondborn so that I would be exposed now. I did consider that it was a suspiciously generous offer, but I will not take the bait this time. The Awakened One doesn't need any help to take down his foes. Whatever you want from me, you will not have it today. We shall see, replied the creature, before thankfully falling silent again. The son of Magnus refocused on his surroundings. More of the mortals were engaging the Sons of Kalth, but they would not break that line without aid. Drawing to him as much power as he could without the librarians noticing, the Lord of the Coven charged toward those he would have once called brothers. In his hands, his staff crackled with energy, and 6 Astartes in grey and yellow armor charged alongside him. The duel between the Lord of the Forsaken Sons and the Loyalist champion had now been going on for 15 minutes, while the troops around the 2 war leaders fought against each other. Both of the duelists were covered in minor wounds, each insignificant of its own but whose sum strained even the Astartes' legendary endurance. Once this was over, Mercurian would need weeks to repair the damage done to the Awakened One's battle plate. Demarian was several dozen meters away from his liege lord, trying to reach a group of sons of Calth with heavy weapons who were butchering tens of mortal soldiers. Some of the slaves had been able to withstand the volleys of bolts, those who had gone through the Fleshmaster's attentions, and been deemed both successful enough to be of use, and of too little interest to be preserved for further experimentation, and they were fighting at his side. Many of them were hybrids of humanity and Astartes genetics, half of them little more than shambling monstrosities who could nonetheless endure far more than unaugmented humans. A squad of tactical marines rose from behind cover, their guns aimed straight at the armored form of the awakened one. Demarian watched it, powerless to act. He was too far from them to do anything. In fact, there was no one who could do anything about it. Somehow, the company champion had arranged the duel so that it would drag Arkan away from his followers, and into the line of fire of these warriors, who had remained hidden since the beginning of the fight, despite their brothers dying, all for that moment. The Astartes were armed with heavy weapons, plasma guns and melters, that would rip through even Terminator armor. Demarian shouted uselessly to his lord to take cover. With a roar of engines, the sky darkened as the familiar shape of a Thunderhawk's fuselage came into view, piercing the clouds of dust long enough for all warriors to see the emblem of the demon's head painted on its side. The heavy bolters placed at the gunship's front opened fire with the most beautiful sound Demarian had ever heard in his life, and tore the squad of Sons of Calth to bloody chunks in a matter of seconds. The Loyalists had exposed themselves in order to get the best shot possible at the awakened one, and they now paid for this missed chance with their lives. But before Demarian could rejoice, Theseus hammered into the Lord of the Forsaken Sons. Abandoning grace and blade play, the champion had seized the momentary distraction caused by Perseus' onslaught, blessed be the mortal for his timely intervention, and threw Arkan to the ground, keeping his own balance only through a feat of precision that awed even Demarian. Theseus lifted his blade, ready to deliver the final blow. But as his weapon began its descent toward the awakened one's unmoving form, the ground near the two warriors exploded as a towering figure in blood-red armor burst from the rubble, holding a great axe in its hands and bellowing with rage and the savage joy of freedom. The surrounding groups of Forsaken Sons, Astartes and mortal soldiers cheered as the blood champion was returned to them. Theseus was thrown away by the shock wave, but rose to his feet with an agility that belied his armor. Behind his helmet, Demarian smiled. He was going to enjoy watching this. Freedom. I roar my fury at the skies as I finally free myself from the Loyalists' trap. My axe's teeth are worn out from the digging I had to do, but even now they are regenerating, eager to taste blood. The rock flows around me in a torrent as I rise, unfurling my wings to lift myself clear. Before me stands a Terminator, holding a power blade and a shield. At his feet lies Arkan, down but still conscious. Our eyes meet, and once more I am reminded of the power that dwells within him as it tightened around my essence, commanding me to act. He knew I was going to emerge at this moment, somehow. He never doubted it, and now he demands I do my duty and kill the one who thought he could defeat the Lord of the Forsaken Sons. My axe falls, and the son of Calth raises his shield to meet it. The buckler, a priceless tool of war that I know has endured decades of war and the fires of the heresy, breaks like kindling before my blow. The blade continues descending, and tear through consecrated armor like paper. Blood, rich and mighty, spills in a torrent, covering my weapon and my armor. The blood of a hero. It eases my pain and closes my wounds, and fills me with a terrible thirst for more. I look around me, and I see more cowards in blue and green retreating. The blood boils in my veins at the sight of their backs. What manner of warrior refuses to face his foes? Bellowing a challenge in Hecaran's voice, I am about to launch myself at their pursuit. A thought holds me back. Last time I did this, it did not end well. I look back at Arkan, who is rising to his feet. My wings and my claws are twitching with bloodlust, and it is all I can do to restrain myself from going ahead regardless of the risks. I wonder, for a time, if Arkan somehow suspected this ambush would happen, and didn't bring any of my former brothers in this assault for that reason. It wouldn't surprise me, but I cannot spend long on that reasoning. Already the thirst is increasing, and clear thinking is eluding me. I need to kill. To slay. To spill blood and claim skulls in Khorne's name. The death of the champion was not enough. Nothing will ever be enough. The last ship was still visible on the horizon when the Forsaken Sons finally reached the harbor. Even after the failure of their ambush, the Loyalists had held their positions and fought to buy time. The three hosts had met and resumed their advance as one, with Archon and the Blood Champion fighting together at the forefront of the advance, but even these two champions of chaos had not been able to advance quickly enough. With booby traps, collapsing charges and a few lightning-like counterattacks, they had slowed down the renegades' advance enough for them to do the impossible, complete the evacuation. They even had managed to escape themselves. The figures of a few Thunderhawks and Stormbirds were quickly vanishing, far quicker than the ship, carrying the survivors of the company the Sons of Kalth had dedicated to their ambush evacuation. A city of millions, emptied by the will of a few Astartes and the work of who knew how many thousands of clerks and workers. Had he not seen it with his own eyes, Demarian wouldn't have believed it. He had expected to find thousands of remaining civilians here, the old, the sick, those who wouldn't be of any use to the Sons of Kalth in their war against the Forsaken Sons. Their slaughter would have been a good way for the warriors to vent their frustration after fighting a retreating enemy in the dust for hours, but their enemy had denied them that. The former captain didn't know if the loyalists had done it solely out of some foolish desire to save the worthless humans, or if they knew it would create tension amongst their foes. Given the bitterness and hate he had felt while fighting them, it could go both ways. He abandoned his idle musings to turn to his master, apprehension rising in his guts. Though the city was theirs, the prey had escaped, and they had taken unacceptable losses in return. Exact casualty figures were still pending, but Demarian estimated that they had lost thousands of human slaves, and perhaps an entire company's worth of Astartes. While the former could easily be replaced, each Marine who fell was a blow to the Forsaken Sons' combat potential. The Flesh Masters could restore a warrior as long as there was a spark of life left in his body, and harvest the gene seed of the fallen to create new generations of transhumans. But both processes took time, and the latter deprived the Warband of the dead's fighting experience. In these conditions, it wouldn't be strange if Archon were to burst in anger. Yet the Awakened One was simply staring at the boat, standing upon a pile of rubble. Behind him stood the Blood Champion, his armor still cracked from the damage it had taken when the possessed had been buried alive. Blood ran from the cracks, and as Demarian looked on, he saw one of them begin to slowly close as the demon exerted its power to heal its host's body. As always, Demarian was amazed at how casually his lord treated the Cornate. Followers of the Blood God despised cowardice, but turning your back to them still didn't strike Demarian as an especially wise move. The World Eater may appear calm for now, but Demarian didn't doubt a second that he, or the Neverborn sharing his body, had considered attacking the Lord of the Forsaken Sons. Whether it was loyalty, the knowledge that Archon could stop him with a single word, or some other arcane compulsion that had stayed his hand, Demarian didn't know and cared little. "We can still order an orbital strike," he offered his lord. "The Hand of Ruin would be able to take out a few of the ships, at least." "There will be no need of that, brother," answered Archon. It was only then that Demarian noticed that the Awakened One was smiling. The boy was just 5 weeks shy of his 14th birthday. He had lost his parents in the chaos that had followed the arrival of the storm, but he hadn't been left alone. Friends of his family had taken care of him, tried to help him get over the loss of all he had. He understood what they were doing, and he appreciated their efforts. But there were times when the memories were too strong, when the images of the monsters who had killed his parents, demons, the priest had called them, were the only thing he could see, and the screams of the dying the only thing he could hear. When these crises happened, he just had to be alone, and wait until it passed. Being alone on one of the evacuation ships, however, was proving to be a challenge. Though the weight safety limits were, if barely, respected, it still meant that thousands of people were crammed on the merchant ship, alongside the absolute minimum in terms of personal belongings. Even the boy was awestruck at how the giants in blue and green had managed to get everyone on the boats. He and his guardians had been embarked on the very last one to leave, and the only ones left behind were the angels and those who wanted to fight at their side. 1 hour later, they were in the middle of the sea, and he was wandering in the darkest parts of the ship, moving between pipes in search of somewhere to cuddle and wait for the images to stop. He didn't have long. Soon he would be unable to see where he was going, and he was still coherent enough to understand just how dangerous that would be. The emergency lights were enough for him to go by, though their red hue didn't help him to keep control of his rising panic. He crawled under one last pipe and emerged into a small square of empty space. He laid down on his back there, breathing deeply despite the stench of machinery in the air. The seizure would take him any moment, and his hands trembled in anticipated terror. And then, he saw the figure suspended above him, kept in place by its hold over the strongest-looking pipes. It was a giant, but not one of the angels who had come to save him and his people. Though it was hard to tell in the dim illumination, his armor appeared to be of a deep, dark blue, with strikes of lightning painted over it. The giant's helm was a winged skull who leered down at the boy with red-eyed lenses. Terror seized the boy's heart, and he felt the memories recede before this new, greater source of fear. "Hello, little one," said the false angel in a deep voice. "My name is Zal Korak." Captain Tarek was a tall man, though he certainly didn't look it while standing before the 11 sons of Calf who were coming aboard his ship through the open cargo bay of the Lady of the Three Seas, the last evacuation ship to have left the doomed city of Merides. Behind them, the Thunderhawk that had brought them to where the ship was currently quarantined, several dozens of kilometers away from the harbor of Talexorn, took off, the winds caused by its engines causing seawater to splash in all directions. "The man looks ridiculous in that getup," Lycaon sent over the squad's private Vox channel. "And it can't possibly be practical." The librarian, who alone still stood in the blue of the 13th Legion, was referring to the captain's overly decorated uniform. In truth, the man looked like he belonged more in a upper hive gala than down here amongst the dirty refugees. But there was steel in his eyes, and the weapons he bore at his belt were more than mere decorations. "It is symbolic," Argus explained. "There is a reason for him to dress like that. It gives him an air of authority that helps keep the civilians calm. These people have lost their homes, and were packed aboard this ship even as the traitors closed in on them. He probably isn't actually commanding the ship, just giving the impression of control in order to avoid a riot. Given what happened here, I would say he performed admirably well in that regard." It was hard for the librarian to argue with that. The mass of unwashed humanity gathered in the great cargo bay stank of fear, but there was no sign of panic. Even with his psychic hood on, Lycaon could feel their emotions, radiating from them in waves. They were scared, but they were holding up. Tarek had managed to keep them from losing their nerves, and the arrival of the Astartes was helping tremendously on that end. A closer look revealed that those on the outside of the group were holding bars of metal in loose fists, forming a protective circle around the women and children inside. Several of the men displayed bandaged wounds. Others were keeping watch. The crew of the Lady had taken positions at the bay's edge, behind rudimentary barricades, their las rifles aimed at the entrances of the room. A few of them were stealing looks at the transhumans in their midst, but they were mostly focused on keeping watch for signs of attack. The librarian's sixth sense picked up vague impressions of what lurked in the rest of the ship, and his respect for these men and their leader increased greatly. "Yes," he admitted. "He did." "My lords," Tarek saluted. "I am glad to see you. The situation here is growing worse by the hour. I am glad to see that reinforcements are on their way." "We are the reinforcements, Captain," Argus said grimly. Seeing that Tarek's expression was growing dark, he continued, "Do not think that our officers are insensible to your plight, but all Astartes are needed, be it to help with the rest of the evacuation or to securize the continent." "I thought we controlled the east?" Tarek asked, surprised. Argus sighed. "We do, in a strictly military sense." Argus wasn't about to share more than that, but he decided that an explanation of the wider situation may help the mortal keep his calm. Most of the traitors' infiltration was concentrated on the other side of the ocean, but there are still pockets of renegades holding out in the wild. Many of my brothers are currently purging them, so that when the traitors attack they won't be able to use them to harass our lines. The others are guarding the hives, preparing them for the Forsaken Sun's inevitable assault. My squad and librarian Lycaon were all we could spare. Now, I have read your reports, but what exactly happened here?" Tarek looked around him, sadness swelling up in his eyes. Then he began his tale. "After leaving Merides, we were sailing toward Talexorn as part of the evacuation plan. Apart from the fact that the city fell just after our depart, it was the same as the other runs at the start, but halfway to our destination, the first accidents happened. Something must have sneaked in at Merides, and it attacked the passengers. After that first attack, we established a defense perimeter in this room, but the concentration of the weight in one place forced us to sail very slowly to avoid the ship breaking apart under the strain. Not all were capable of reaching us, however. Then we were attacked again, but this time by warp-born creatures, and though we took many casualties, we were able to drive them off. Nevertheless, we had to abandon the deck and the engines to gather here. I sent the call for aid at that moment, before stopping the ship and coming here. That was 2 hours ago, and we have been waiting for your arrival since." The captain looked down, shame and anger at himself burning in his eyes. "I didn't expect any of it," he murmured. "I thought that the danger was behind us, that we were bringing these people to safety, or at least, as safe as anyone can be on this world, and now, so many of them are dead." "You did what was expected of you, Captain," Argus interrupted. "It is already impressive that you managed to fight the warp spawn. Not many men can do such a thing and survive." "That creature that attacked the civilians in the beginning," asked Lycaon. "What can you tell us about it?" "We don't know for certain what it was. The survivors' testimonies are troubled. Whatever it was, it heralded its attack with several hours of psychological warfare, cutting off the lights for a few seconds and playing with the nerves of the guards and civilians with disquieting sounds. What we do know for certain is that this initial attack was the doing of a single being, who slaughtered dozens of civilians and ignored the fire of the guards' weapons. I would suspect one of the traitors, or perhaps a stronger demon than the ones who attacked later. It is indeed the most probable possibility." Already a suspicion had begun to form in the back of the Space Marines' minds. This description reminded them all too much of one of the most hateful enemies they had faced during the heresy, a title wildly contested by the filthy traitors. "You left the boat's control room. Could our foe move the ship if it went there?" "No," answered Tarek. "At least, not without a tech priest. I destroyed the controls before leaving, to ensure that the lady wouldn't be used as a weapon of the traitors. A wise decision. Once we have dealt with the threat, we will call for evacuation. We can't risk more assets until it is removed." "You said that there were other attacks, led by demons this time. How many died?" the sergeant inquired. Tarek shook his head, sadly. "Too many," he said. "There were almost 1,000 people aboard when we left Merides. Now, the only ones remaining are those you see here. Only a third survived, and we still have several wounded who may not make it if they aren't given proper medical care." "Then there is no time to waste. We will." Argus was interrupted by a screeching wail coming from the bay's other side. At once, Tarek drew his last pistol and his saber and ran toward the barricades. The sergeant turned to Lycaon, not needing to ask the question before the librarian answered in a voice filled with hatred. "Demons." The being that called itself the Shadow of Horus floated lifelessly in its containment tank. Black fluids flowed out of the dents in the possessed armor, before dissolving in the nutritive liquid. When the unconscious Unbound had been brought back from the ruins of Merides, his body torn by loyalist blades, the sorcerers who had examined him had declared that the balance of power within Aloran's body had shifted. The demon had been weakened by the blows of the Sons of Calth, and now the Spireborn was ascendant in their union, though he was still too weak to wake up. The rate of regeneration was still very low. It would take weeks before Aloran's wounds were fully gone, but that was fine. Arkan had assured that he wouldn't need the Shadow of Horus on the battlefield for a time. And while the members of the Coven were curious as to how exactly the Loyalists had inflicted such damage, it was of little concern to the one who was to ensure Aloran would retake his place amongst the Forsaken Sons. Satisfied with his examination of the possessed, Jikaros turned to face the other subject in the room. His own armored figure looked back at him, reflected in the reinforced glass of the other containment tank. As always, the Fleshmaster wore his helm, concealing from sight the mutations he had acquired on Mula Secundus. Doubt had no place in Anastate's mind. Like fear, it was removed from the legionaries during their induction, and replaced by an intellectual process aimed at making them more effective soldiers. A Space Marine didn't doubt, he questioned, seeking the most effective way to his goal. To doubt your commander's words and orders was anathema, for it was the root of confusion and disorder, and these were the quickest path to failure. Yet standing before the fruit of his work in the room of the Hand of Ruin he had claimed as his personal laboratory, Jikaros, former apothecary of the Alpha Legion, Fleshmaster of the Forsaken Sons, couldn't help but feel a sliver of unease at what he had done at the Awakened One's command. The body that floated in the pod was outwardly perfect, yet also wholly alien. It was humanoid in form, but could never be mistaken for human. It was too thin, too graceful, the bones and muscles subtly different from humanity's template in a way that even an uneducated child could realize was wrong. Here was the body of an Eldar, recreated from the scraps of genetic materials found in the remains Jacaerus had excavated in the Temple of Parasksis Beta. Not the genes of the craft-world Eldar, who denied themselves emotions in order to avoid their doom, nor that of their Camorra kin, whose thirst for pain was the only way to stave off damnation. This was the body of an Eldar from the time of the Xenos' Great Empire. And not just any Eldar, a lord of that mighty realm, which had conquered the galaxy in a time when humans were still exploring the uses of sharp rocks on distant Terra. Not that Jacaerus cared about the nobility of his specimen, but the attention given to the mortal remains had ensured that the Fleshmaster could find what he needed in order to perform what Archon had demanded of him. However, while the cloning of an alien species was in itself enough to warrant the traitor legionary execution under Imperial law, it was only the first step of the heresy the Awakened One had ordered. The body was only a vessel, and with it forcefully grown into adulthood, it was an empty one, devoid of soul or consciousness. The next part of the process, the one that truly worried the Fleshmaster, would be performed not by him, but by the member of the coven that was with him in his laboratory. Orpheus was a sorcerer in whose veins flowed Fulgrim's gene seed. Like most of the proud sons of the Phoenician amongst the Forsaken Sons, he had kept his legion's colors, only marking his shoulder pad black to signify that his allegiance was no longer to his uncaring Primarch. He was wearing a psychic hood that had once belonged to a Thousand Son who no longer needed it, having been torn in twain by a demon's claws during the Exodus. The hood still left his noble and cruel face visible. There were several runes carved into the skin, forming a pattern pleasing to the two Force swords hung from his belt, their blades adorned with several of the symbols of Slunch. One, Jacaerus knew, had once been wielded by a librarian of the First Legion, while the second had been claimed on the corpse of an Imperial Fist Psyker. Unlike the sons of the Cyclops aboard the Hand of Ruin, Orpheus hadn't been born a Psyker, nor had he ever been part of a librarians. The Third Legion had refused the instauration of such an organization, and the Edict of Nicaea had only comforted Fulgrim in that decision. But after the Emperor's children had thrown away their allegiance to the Golden Throne and embraced the path of the Dark Prince, many amongst their numbers had sought to gain mastery over the Immaterium, seeing it as a way to access sensations previously undreamt of. Through study of the dark arts and various pacts with the Neverborn of the Dark Prince's court, they had attempted to gain psychic powers of their own. Most of them had failed, or died in atrocious agony as their soul was rent apart by the energies they ought to master. But those who hadn't had become very powerful very quickly, capable of unleashing unto their foes the wonders and horrors of their divine patron's domain. It was said that the scions of Slunch whispered secrets into the ears of the sorcerers who served the profligate one, increasing their knowledge in the hope that they may one day use their disciples' burst corpse as a gateway into the Materium. Many had met just such a fate at Terra, when the Emperor's children had unleashed their twisted lusts upon the throne world's population, and 4 of Orpheus' brothers had succumbed that way during the Exodus. The last surviving Psyker of the Third Legion aboard the Hand of Ruin had been closely watched for the rest of the journey through the storms, but Orpheus had managed to keep the demons seeking to use him at bay. Now, he was a member of the Coven, and the one who had the greatest chance of successfully performing the arcane feat required by the Awakened One's design. While Jacaerus checked on Aloran, Orpheus had drawn a circle around the Xenos clone's pod, using the blood of slaves slain after hours of tortures and the tears of their loved ones as they watched. The regents would act as a sympathetic catalyst for the sorcerer's ritual, drawing the attention of the Neverborn and giving potency to the invocations of the Emperor's child. As ever, the sight of a technological marvel surrounded by eldritch symbols still conjured a sense of dark amusement in the Fleshmaster's heart. This was the proof that the Imperial truth had always been a lie, that superstition and madness were actually the way things worked in this galaxy. Adding to the blasphemy were the Xenos devices connected to the pod. They were relics from Parasksis' time under the corrupted Elder's rule, plundered by the Forsaken Sons from the secret vaults where open-minded adepts of the Mechanicum had sought to unlock their secrets. Jacaerus had succeeded where they had failed, thanks in part to the visions of Parasksis Beta's past that he had had in the temple where he had found the remains. Somehow, these had granted him an understanding of the mechanisms designed by the aliens who had survived the fall and embraced Slunch. Ever since returning from that cursed world, the Fleshmaster's slumber had been haunted by images of the time between the birth of the Dark Prince and the coming of the Imperium to Parasksis. What he saw every time he let himself sleep may have been useful, but it also made him understand why the Ultramarines had razed the entire planet rather than conquer it as they had done on Parasksis Alpha. From what little he had learned of the system's capital world, its people had got off easy compared to the horrors inflicted on the human slaves of the second planet. Every dream not only made him fear for his own soul, for they were clearly a sign of mental pollution, and Jacaerus had no desire to be forced into the service of the Dark Prince, but also made him uneasy about the whole plan. The Alpha Legion had dealt with aliens before. Indeed, it had been the words of a group of Xenos that had first determined the course of the 20th Legion when Horus Lupercal had called for rebellion. But even Alpharius would never have considered what the Awakened One had commanded Jacaerus to do, bring the Xenos overlords of Paraxis back to life, so that the Forsaken Sons may ally with them and gain favor in the eyes of Slunch by returning his toys into the Materium. If they succeeded, there was no doubt that the fallen elders would be powerful allies. But Jacaerus wasn't as certain as his lord that the arrogant, self-serving, utterly corrupt Xenos would accept to serve under Archon's command, for what other relationship could there possibly be between the Awakened One and those who would own him their very existence? But it wasn't Jacaerus' place to doubt. His place was to ensure that the plans of Archon were made reality, and even on that front, he had his share of misgivings. "Are you sure you can do it?" the former Alpha Legionnaire asked Orpheus. Despite the sorcerer's confidence, he still wasn't convinced that what they were about to attempt was actually possible. There was just no precedent for it. Cloning itself was a fairly common technology in the Imperium, though it was generally limited to the growth of replacement limbs or the purveyance of flesh bodies for the creation of servitors. Even the recreation of the genetic code, in itself, wasn't that unheard of. There were old bloodlines of Terra that had sought to purify their own genetics after they were polluted by radiations or inbreeding. The means by which Jacaerus had accomplished both may have been unorthodox, involving warp energies and demon engines, but he had still known that it had been done before. What Orpheus was about to do, however, was unprecedented even in the ranks of the Dark Mechanicum, at least as far as Jacaerus knew, and the Fleshmaster's knowledge reached quite far indeed. "I am certain, Fleshmaster," Orpheus answered. The child of the Emperor's voice was as soft as velvet, and utterly at odds with his scarred face and his demented eyes. "The youngest god looks fondly on our master's plan, and how could I fail in his sight?" This was one aspect of Orpheus that the Fleshmaster didn't appreciate. Like the half-breed Mikhail, he was a devotee of the Dark Prince, an actual believer, not a simple hedonist like many of his legion. He sought the favor of his god with uncanny greed, and while the rewards he had received for that devotion had served the Warband well, Jacaerus still didn't consider him trustworthy. But he was the sorcerer with the greatest affinity with the task at hand, and so Jacaerus couldn't afford to alienate him at this point. Still, it couldn't hurt to ask for confirmation, so close to success or abject failure. "And will that favor help you locate one soul amongst the trillions that dwell in your patron's realm?" The souls of the elders burn with a particular brightness in the sea of souls, and those of the few who have embraced Slunch's path brighter still. With the support of the circle, and considering what we are using as a receptacle dash, he gestured to the floating clone with one gauntleted hand dash, there is little doubt that this will work. Besides, I will not seek one particular soul, just one belonging to one of Paraxis' old masters. The only risk I see is if something else uses the opportunity to enter the Materium, and you and I are more than capable of dealing with any demon that would try to possess your work. Of course, in that case you would have to start over, but that wouldn't be too much of a setback, Jacaerus finished. Now that I have the genetic sequence, recreating a body is but a question of days. There, you see? Even you know that we are close to success. And think about what our deeds will entail for the future. Once the first of Slunch's scions is incarnated, we will bring others into our reality. Think of the pleasures and secrets we may learn from them. It will be glorious. And the fact that Archon seeks to forge an alliance with aliens doesn't disturb you? Though the question burned his lips, Jacaerus knew better than to ask. Orpheus probably wouldn't even understand what the Fleshmaster meant, so engrossed was he in the possibilities the resurrection would open. "Very well," he said instead. "Begin the ritual." The sorcerer of Slunch drew both of his blades, and held them vertically before him. His mouth began to move, though no sound left his lips. As he channeled raw power within him, his eyes and the runes of his sword started to glow with an unearthly lilac light, while the other illuminations of the room dimmed. Jacaerus' head began to throb as the veil between dimensions began to thin so that Orpheus may reach into the warp and drag back the soul of one of the damned Xenos. His eyes darted back to the sigils inscribed on the walls of the laboratory, seals designed to keep the Ombion power level beneath a certain threshold, or contain the destruction to the room in the worst case. Jacaerus was no psyker. He wasn't able to perceive the titanic effort of will by which Orpheus' soul dwelled into the realm of the Prince of Pleasure without succumbing to its lures, nor was he able to feel the power the sorcerer expended in order to defy the natural order and bring the dead back into the world of the living. But he did catch glimpses of the hell behind reality as the veil was breached, and saw the sorcerer's hand close into a fist a moment before something black and swirling was torn from the sea of souls. For a few seconds, the black cloud hovered in the air above the clone's tank, before plunging through its lid as if it wasn't there and into the clone's open, slack mouth. With the completion of the spell, the power gathered in the room began to dissipate, and Orpheus stepped away from the glass tank, his steps unsteady, so great had been the strain, letting Jacaerus approach. The Flesh Master looked at the clone, while at the same time monitoring its vitals, displayed on his helmet's retinal display. The first sign that Orpheus' spell had any effect at all was a spike in the biorhythms of the Eldar, quickly followed by the Xenos opening its eyes in the tank. For a fraction of a second, Jacaerus gazed into eyes as blue as the skies of old Earth, before the clone's entire eyeballs turned black. Its mouth opened, revealing pointed teeth, and it hammered its fists into the glass, cracking the reinforced material and displaying physical strength far above what the fragile aliens were supposed to possess. In the days to come, what Argus would remember most of the battle would be the laughter. Not that of the demons that surged from the shadows to attack the guards, though it was certainly disturbing in its own right, but that of the crazed humans who were hurled before the Neverborn, forming a wall of flesh behind which the creatures could hide. The sound was entirely mirthless and devoid of humor, instead conveying all the horror of a soul broken to pieces by the dark power of the warp and afflicted with the same corruption that, not so long ago, had turned half of the Imperium's Space Marine legions against their legitimate emperor. Tarok hadn't talked about these wretches, and judging by the horrified reactions of his men, it was clear that this was the first time the warp spawns attacked with the support of their mortal thralls. Whatever fell power was at work here must have kept them in reserve, or perhaps their tragic transformation had only recently been completed. Men, women and even children charged the lines of the guards, screaming and laughing insanely. Their bodies bore hideous, self-inflicted wounds that reflected the damn the beardage done to their souls, and their clothes were torn and dirtied by blood and excrement. Most of them were weaponless, but a few clung makeshift clubs, iron bars, repurposed tools and even a few human limbs. Whatever the demons had done to them, it had shattered their sanity to the point that they kept charging and laughing even as they were cut down by the few volleys the shocked sailors managed to loose. Part of Argus wanted to scorn the mortals for their hesitation, but the rest of him remembered all too well how it felt to see one's own kin turning to madness and attacking you. If even the genetically engineered transhumans of the Legionis Astartes needed time to adapt, it was to be expected that the guards would react that way. Although these men had lived through the horrors unleashed upon their world by the arrival of the warp storm, it was only human of them to hesitate in the face of such a scene. Fortunately, Argus and his brothers weren't human anymore. Their hearts, already tempered by the process that had turned them into Astartes, had grown cold after the betrayal of their kindred and the death of their birth world. They still cared about the humans under their protection, but they would not let misplaced sentiment get in the way of carrying out their duty. The mad wretches were already lost. The Ultramarines had paid in blood to learn that there was no return for those who had been claimed by the corruption of chaos. The only thing that mattered was the protection of the remaining civilians, and the only mercy that could be granted to the attackers was that of a swift death. As one, the sons of Kalth opened fire, the sound of their bolt guns resonating in the enclosed space with near-deafening force. Bolt shells tore through skin and muscles and shattered bones to pieces with contemptuous ease before detonating in showers of gore. Each shot was a kill, no matter where it hit, and with the throng of madmen as compact as it was coupled with the short distance between the charge and the Astartes, every bolt found its target. Dozens of poor souls were laid to rest in a handful of seconds, none of them making it as far as the defenders' barricade, but then again, it had never been their objective. Behind the first wave of sacrificial flesh came the Neverborn, protected from the onslaught by the sacrifice of their mortal pawns. They were creatures of pure darkness, as if their half-material bodies had materialized from congealed shadow. Humanoid in form, they were a bit smaller than an Astartes and a lot thinner, with multiple eyes that blazed with unholy light and claws that dripped drops of black liquid on the metal floor, causing small holes to appear into it as the steel suffered the touch of the unnatural substance. The demons were laughing, the sound so filled with malice that it made Argus wince. Their laughter was the sound of screams of terror, cut apart and distilled before being released into the material world as a sonar plague that drilled its way into the mortal brain. "In the Emperor's name, brothers!" Argus shouted, sheathing his bolter and drawing his chainsword. He advanced across the defender's line, holding his weapon high. "Destroy these abominations!" The demons crashed into the Astartes like an evil tide on a fortified shore. The 9 battle brothers and their sergeant fought with their blades, knowing that their guns would only have a slight effect on the etheric creatures, while Lycaon unleashed bolts of coruscant energy at the nightmarish host. To the Space Marine's surprise, the human defenders' own weapons did damage the demons. By acting as teams that focused all of their firepower on a single creature at a time, the mortals were capable of felling even the unholy spawn of the warp. Then again, they had faced the creatures before, and survived the confrontation without the Astartes' help. Although this particular assault presented greater numbers of demons as before, the sailors still knew how to fight against the Neverborn. Yet the demons kept coming, no matter how many the Space Marines and the humans cut down. The pressure on the battle line intensified, and it was all they could do to prevent them from breaching through sheer numbers. Behind them, Argus heard Lycaon shout a warning. The veil between dimensions was thinning even further, allowing more of the infernal creatures to join the fight. Someone, probably the first enemy that had infiltrated the ship, was performing a ritual, granting new strength to the demonic assault. But even the blasphemous servants of the ruinous powers had their limits. If they could hold on long enough, victory would be theirs. And so they kept on fighting, Astartes and humans united against the forces of darkness. There was a symbolism in that battle that didn't escape Argus' attention. This was what the legions had been forged for, but they had allowed their pride and superiority to distance them from the humanity they were made to protect. Perhaps if more legionaries had fought alongside humans, the dark gods would have found the corruption of the Emperor's scions less easy. "No!" Argus screamed in bitter fury as his blade missed one of the Neverborn by a hair's breadth. It landed behind him, and ran straight toward the gathered civilians. The sergeant turned, but it was too late. He couldn't fire at the creature without risking hitting one of the humans. Memories of the underworld war flashed in his mind's eye, images of carnage and butchery, when the word-bearers had breached through the Ultramarines' defenses and reached the caverns where the world's survivors had hidden from the radioactive sun. A vast, foul creature. The demon of shadow screamed in pain and mindless anger, and stepped back from the crowd. Before him stood an old man wearing the dirty robes of Paraxis Ecclesiarchy and carrying in his hands an imperial aquila. The symbol was shining with golden light, smoke rising from it at its proximity with the creature of the warp. Sparks of energy danced along the Neverborn's silhouette as it focused its attention on the priest. "In the name of the God Emperor, who watches over all from his throne on holy terror, I command you. Begone, spawn of the ruinous powers." As ever, hearing the words of humans venerating the Emperor as a god caused conflicted feelings within Argus' heart. As an Astartes, and a loyal son of the Imperium, he respected the Emperor, beloved by all, and carried within him the fruit of his work through the gene seed of Guilliman. He knew the kind of effect the Primarchs had on mortals, and that the Emperor himself had a far greater aura. So when news of the Ecclesiarchy's ascension had reached him, Argus hadn't been much surprised. The galaxy was a dark and dangerous place, and belief in a supreme being whose benevolence and protection were spread across the star had an undeniable appeal as well as moralizing effect to it. But he had also been a warrior in the Great Crusade, when the legions had fought to free mankind from superstition and ignorance. He knew now that the imperial truth had been wrong, that there were indeed powers that bypassed the laws of the universe and grew from the prayers of those they fooled into worshipping them. Gods were real, but they were also creatures of sapient evil, whose only desire was the damnation of humanity. For the Emperor to be turned into a divinity by those he had struggled to lead to ascension was both supremely ironic, a dark necessity of this new age, and an insult against every ideal for which the legions had fought before the heresy. Confronted with these contradictions, most Space Marines chose to ignore the faith of the humans they fought for, honoring the Emperor through their own rituals and expressing their devotion through battle. The priest continued to recite his prayers, keeping the Neverborn at bay. But even Argus, who was still fighting the rest of the demonic horde, could see that the old man was weakening. Sweat ran down his wrinkled face, and veins bulged all around his eyes as he pushed himself beyond his limits. He was no psyker, had no special gift to call upon in order to perform this miracle. All he had was his unwavering faith in the Emperor of Man, and his burning will to protect those under his spiritual aegis. Perhaps the Neverborn was being hurt by the emotions of the priest, so contrary were they to those who constitute the demon's core. Perhaps the collective psychic potential of the civilians was being channeled through the priest, allowing him to repel the creature. Or perhaps it was truly the Emperor's divine intervention, reaching even here in the warp storm to protect his people. Perhaps it was none of these things, or all of them. Either way, it wasn't enough. The Neverborn kept advancing toward the priest, struggling every step as if it was walking against a powerful tide. Finally, it stood less than a meter away from the old man, who looked like he was about to go into heart arrest from the exertion he was subjecting himself to. The demon lifted its claws, and was blown apart by a bolt of lightning cast from Lycaon's staff. With a final scream of helpless fury, the Neverborn's form dissolved into smoke that quickly vanished altogether, its essence banished back to the Sea of Souls. With the last of the assaulting demons dispatched, Lycaon had finally could turn from the front line and use his powers to remove the threat to the civilians. His armor was covered in a layer of frost, and small arcs of energy danced over his staff as he rested it on the floor. The vitals Argus was receiving from his squad mate's armor told him that the librarian was tired, if not yet exhausted. Faith and prayers are all good and well, Lycaon breathed through his helmet's vox grid, but I think these abominations require a more concrete expression of the Emperor's wrath. Don't you agree, priest? The second hit of the creature's fists shattered the panel. Foul liquids, tainted by Xeno's fluids and etheric energies, poured through the opening, quickly followed by the body of the resurrected elder. It crashed on the floor, its limbs trembling as the soul now inhabiting it tried to understand what was happening, and relearned how it felt to be made of flesh, bone and blood. Jacaerus lowered himself to his knees to examine the fruit of his and Orpheus' work closely, still on his guard in case the creature attempted something violent. For all that it was supposed to be the first of a new race of allies, it probably didn't know it, nor could it be trusted in any fashion. Xenos were notoriously treacherous, elders even more so, and those of their number who had embraced the Dark Prince would doubtlessly prove the worst of all. Once again, his paranoia proved an asset, for the alien turned on him the moment the traitor marine's shadow fell upon it. It jumped, and crashed against Jacaerus' armored form. Its hands, whose fingers now ended with claws of sharp bone, struck at his armor, seeking a weak point through which they would reach the flesh beneath. Despite the Xeno's lithe form, its strength was enormous. Not enough to force its way through Jacaerus' mutated, half-living armor, but enough to be a threat if they had met on the battlefield, each carrying weapons. As it was, Jacaerus and his creation fell on the floor, struggling against each other like wrestlers from some primitive feral world. Subject shows strength at the level of an unarmored Astartes, some corner of the Fleshmaster's psyche thought idly while he was struggling to free himself from the Xeno's hold. Possibly greater. He is using the warp to strengthen himself, Orpheus warned. The sorcerer's tone was utterly unconcerned with the Fleshmaster's predicament. It contained only curiosity and a faint amusement at what he was seeing. Do you need my help? Strength seems to come from drawing into the warp's energies, probably using the soul's familiarity with its depths. Potential limitation, subject cannot draw it for an extended period of time. No, Jacaerus answered. Then he noted the pronoun the son of Fulgrim had used to indicate the clone, and a scowl formed under his helm. I can deal with it. Using the additional force provided by his armor's systems, the Fleshmaster managed to free himself from the Xenos. He then drew his weapon, eliciting a sharp exclamation from Orpheus. The sorcerer wanted their common creation to remain alive, not be blown apart. But Jacaerus ignored his brother, and hammered the bottom of his bolter into the creature's delicate face, breaking bones and splattering black blood on his armor. Damaging his work went against his nature, but he wasn't about to let the wretched thing kill him. If worst came to worst, he and Orpheus could always make another. Yet these thoughts were not needed. The moment he looked at the Xeno's visage again, its skin was already knitting itself back, and its shattered nose and cheekbones were fusing back in place. Its eyes flickered open as its battered brain reasserted its hold over its body, and it snarled in both delight and undiluted fury. Jacaerus shuddered. Fighting devotees of Sludge was always a disturbing experience, mainly because they enjoyed being hurt almost as much as they enjoyed hurting others. Subject displays a regenerative ability, apparently activated subconsciously by taking damage. Process appears similar to the Secondborn's own ability to mend their own flesh and armor through the power of the demons they harbor in their souls. Ignoring the voice in his head, apparently the latest symptom of the madness that had taken hold in his psyche during his sojourn on Mula Secundus and had been strengthened by the frescoes of Paraxis Beta, Jacaerus knocked the clone unconscious again, this time by head-butting it. The ceramite of his helmet, propulsed by his neck muscles and his armor's servos, would have been able to pulverize concrete. He held back just enough to ensure he didn't turn the clone's head into pulp. It took 23 seconds for the creature to regenerate from this blow, and when the Xenos opened its eyes again, it found itself looking up the barrel of Jacaerus' bolt pistol, aimed straight at the center of its forehead. Regeneration or not, a shot from the weapon at point-blank range would turn the creature's skull into crimson mist, something even pure Neverborn had difficulties surviving. It would be the resurrected Eldar's death, its soul cast back into the warp, and all present in the room knew that its god would be greatly displeased with its servant if it allowed itself to be banished so soon. Jacaerus had half a mind of simply pulling the trigger, then kill Orpheus as well before destroying his work and tell the awakened one that the whole experiment had been a catastrophic failure. There was a darkness in the clone's eyes, a vicious and depthless hunger that the Fleshmaster remembered all too well. The wretched creature that had guided him on Paraxis Beta had displayed the same thirst for sensation, the same obscene pride and arrogance, a deep-seated belief that its own existence was the only thing that mattered in the universe. Such a creature was dangerous, perhaps more so than Arkan himself could suspect. He played with the idea for a moment, before abandoning it. It wasn't even sure that he could kill Orpheus before the sorcerer blasted him apart with his mind, weakened from the ritual or not. And after all that he had done, the Fleshmaster just had to trust that Arkan knew what he was doing. Yield, Jacaerus snarled. He wasn't sure if the creature could hear him, let alone understand his words. But despite the differences between species, body language still held some sway amongst the elders, and there were few things easier to understand than the unmistakable shape of a gun's barrel aimed at one's skull. Across the entire galaxy, all the species Jacaerus had met that had invented gunpowder could recognize such a gesture. Apparently, even the returned soul of Xenos whose species had once ruled the galaxy before its arrogance gave birth to the dark god that would one day consume them into oblivion could recognize the threat for what it was. It froze, and the bloodlust in its eyes began to dissipate as realization settled in its mind. Its black eyes returned to their blue hue, and the aura of unnatural power that had surrounded it since its awakening dimmed. It did not disappear. Being this close to the creature still set Jacaerus' teeth on edge, and not only because it was in his every instinct to abhor the Xenos in all its forms. The Fleshmaster suspected that the reborn Eldar would always have an active warp aura, whether it was using it or not, the consequence of spending centuries of objective time into the Sea of Souls as a fleshless entity. Subject is capable of reasoning and survival instinct, and displays signs of self-awareness despite the intense psychological trauma it has undoubtedly undergone. Limited shape-shifting abilities exist, though they appear to only manifest when the subject uses its connection to the warp. Linked to the Secondborn's transformation? Then the clone opened its mouth and started speaking in a stream of song-like syllables that grated on Jacaerus' nerves. He had heard these words before, in the corridors of the Hand of Ruin as he fought against the spawn of the warp. Seeing that its interlocutors didn't understand it, it changed dialects, this time using a language formed of guttural sounds. But still neither the Fleshmaster nor the sorcerer understood it. After several more attempts, it finally began to speak, with what seemed to be reluctance on its proud features, in a bastardized version of Imperial Gothic that the Astartes, thanks to their hypno-training, could understand. The language, like so many others across the worlds colonized during the great diaspora of mankind, took its roots in idioms of old art, but had been twisted by centuries of isolation and, if Jacaerus was correct, the merciless attentions of its speakers' cruel masters. The Fleshmaster remembered what he had seen in the temple. This was the language of the slaves to darkness, those humans whose ancestors had crashed on the ancient Elders' worlds, and had been made to serve the Xenos through their work and their flesh. My apologies. The last word actually meant regret for an experience not fully savored, but Jacaerus chose to interpret it otherwise lest he lost his temper and kill his creation. For this assault, warrior. I was troubled by my unexpected, but welcome return into the world of flesh and matter. Are you the one I have to thank for this wonderful experience? Cognition established. Communication possible. The alliance sought by the Awakened One seems to be conceivable. We were the ones who engineered your return, yes, answered Jacaerus, cautiously standing up, his bolter still aimed at the clone's skull in case it decided to resume its previous attack. Through the bones of one of your race's leaders, I recreated your flesh, and my brother here dipped into the Immaterium to reclaim your soul from the Dark Prince's grasp. He did not reclaim my soul. He pleaded at the foot of our common mistress' throne, and asked for a boon that would benefit all of the court of pleasure and pain. And it pleased my mistress to grant this boon to him. I am the first of the Shai-Alat, said the Xenos. The firstborn child of the goddess that thirsts, returned from her embrace by your work and the power of your sorcerer, as you say. But I am also the herald of a new race, forged in the image of the goddess from the frail flesh of those who brought her to life yet failed to give her the worship she is due. Shai-Alat. That word wasn't from any Gothic root that the Fleshmaster could identify. Jacaerus knew several Eldar dialects, even if the ones the creature had employed at the beginning of its attempts to communicate were not amongst them. The word didn't exist in any of them, but its meaning could be divined from a few others. Had he still possessed eyebrows on his scaled face, the Fleshmaster would have risen them. The rest of the speech was irrelevant, self-aggrandizing religious nonsense, the kind that the word-bearers used to rouse the human herds. But that word caught his attention. You claim to be one of the children of hell? He asked. Regardless of how accurate that may be, it was a strange thing to name yourself. Of hell? The Eldar thing mused. Ah, yes. I see how it could be understood as such. In your language, I would rather say son of the goddess. But you of all people, son of the Hydra, should know that words can have many meanings, depending on who is speaking. I am no longer a son of Alpharius, groaned the Fleshmaster. Behind him, Orpheus chuckled. The cloned Eldar merely looked puzzled. Alpharius? I know not of one of that name. I speak of the creature to the likeness of which your body is being remade by the gifts of the Sea of Souls. Its mark is upon you, and it is reshaping your flesh. The Hydra, he said cautiously, is a mythological creature. My former legion chose it as its emblem because it appealed to our methods of war. It does not exist on any world known to man, indeed, it cannot possibly exist as a living creature. It is a metaphor for something which cannot be put down, which returned from death every time it appears to have been slain, even stronger than before. Nothing more than that. Now you are being willingly obtuse, Jacaerus, said Orpheus. We are no longer fools blinded by the false light of the so-called imperial truth. We know that the warp is filled with these very things we once derided as metaphors and myths. If our friend here say that the Hydra exists in the warp, who are we to doubt him? He would know of such things better than you or I, perhaps better even than my esteemed leader Arsim. And do you have a name, Xenos? Jacaerus asked, ignoring Orpheus' words. Once he knows you are awake, our lord will want to speak with you. It will be an awkward conversation if he does not know what to call you. A name? Yes, I had one once, before your blue-clad king came to our empire of wonders and slaughtered us. It has been so long. Ah, I remember now. Ezirithn. That was my name in my previous life. Not the one I was born with, of course, the one I chose for myself after the goddess elevated me and my peers. And what would your lord the Xenos barely kept its contempt from showing in the word, want with me? I am privy to some of our master's designs, answered the Fleshmaster, but it is not my place to inform you of them. He will tell you that himself. Conclusion. The scientist part of Jacaerus' mind finished its analysis of the creature that had just named itself Ezirithn. Experiment is a success. Proceed to the Awakened One for the next step of the process. With the last of the demons and maddened humans slain, the sons of Kalth left the civilians under the guard of Captain Tarek and his men, and began to search the ship for the source of the demonic intrusion. The priest, a man named Father Colin, who had once been a rich merchant and had given up all of his possessions when he had found religion, had begun to give their last rites to the crew members who had died in the battle, as well as to the poor souls that had been turned against their kindred. Argus wasn't certain that prayers could do anything for the shades of those who had been ravaged by chaos, but he hadn't said anything about it. Instead, he had promised Tarek that he and his brothers would find the one responsible for this and bring it to justice. They were following Lycaon's lead across the ladies' corridors. The librarian was deploying his psychic sense around them, trying to trace the source of the ritual that had allowed the demons to manifest and empowered them during the fight. As they advanced, the reality around them began to shift and twist. Typically, there wasn't much space wasted on a ship, and every place not designed to hold cargo or as living space for the crew was filled with the machines needed to keep the vessel sailing. But here, there were vast corridors and halls that would have been more fitting aboard a long-abandoned starship. The transgression of Euclidean space was only one of the signs of demonic presence. Another were the corpses that the sons of Calth passed as they made their way through the ship. Not all of the civilians who had been lost to the intruding forces' advance had been turned into insane wretches to be hurled at the survivors' lions. The sons of Calth passed before piles of bodies, maimed and bled dry, with their blood used to draw blasphemous sigils on the walls. The Space Marines ignored those, simply letting their anger be stoked by the atrocities wrought upon the Emperor's subjects, until they found one particular sign. Drawn in blood on a wall that had once been metal but now appeared to be made of some kind of grey stone was a skull surrounded by two bat-like wings. It was a mark that all legionaries and many traumatized Imperial citizens who had lived during the heresy knew. It was a symbol that many amongst the 500 worlds had caused to hate, for those who bore it had inflicted many horrors upon Guilliman's kingdom after the lion had broken their backs. It was the emblem of the treacherous 8th Legion, the Night Lords, masters of terror and butchers of countless innocents. At last, the identity of the one responsible for the horrible fate of the Lady of the Three Seas' passengers was revealed, and the theory of the Sons of Calth vindicated. The Marines paused before it, taking a few seconds to renew the oaths of vengeance they had sworn against all traitors and remembering all they knew of 8th Legion's tactics in preparation for what was to come. 10 minutes later on Lycaon's chronometer, which were 5 on Argus, and 20 on another of their brothers, the Sons of Calth reached the nexus of the chaotic energies that were warping the structure of the ship. The room was vast, its walls seemingly made of living, pulsing flesh. Smashed tables and chairs indicated that prior to the demonic intrusion, this had probably been a diner room of some kind. At the center of the room was a circle drawn in blood, with symbols traced in the same foul ink around it and glowing with contained power. Within the circle laid a single male human, no more than a child if Lycaon's memories of what mortals were supposed to look like during their growth were correct. Though the boy was unconscious, his body twitched regularly and was covered in sweat, and his face was frozen in an expression of utter dread. Around the circle were dozens of the shadow demons that the squad had fought alongside the sailors. While the Space Marines took stock of the situation, another of the creature formed above the prone form of the child, manifesting from a twist in the air that was the reflection of a warp breach on the mortal plane. "What in the name of the Emperor," hissed Targus over the Vox, "is that?" Already Lycaon's training was taking hold, pushing aside his concern and moral revulsion and focusing on the arcane implications of what he was seeing, both with his eyes and his sixth sense. Currents of energies went from the boy to the rift in reality, and immaterial demons pressed around him. A more focused look revealed to him the nature of the energies going from the boy's tormented psyche to the circle, and he felt his lips curl in disgust. "Fear," he growled. "This circle is using the child's nightmares in order to fuel whatever fell purposes this blasphemy was designed for." "Exactly," said a voice coming from the circle's direction. The Sons of Calth tensed, aiming their bolters at the shadows but holding their fire. "So you have arrived. I wondered how your commanders would react to my presence. I am somehow vexed that they would only send one squad, but then again, it was only useless mortals at risk here." A silhouette emerged from amongst the crowd of demons, manifesting from their midst as if coalescing from the Neverborn's very essence. It was an Astartes, wearing power armor the color of night sky and lightning, with a winged helmet that was the color of bone and mimicked a leering skull. Though his shoulder pad had been repainted black, it was obvious that this was a warrior of the Night Lord's Legion. Runes that hurt Lycaon's eyes were inscribed on the ceramite's surface and glowed with unearthly light, while tendrils of shadow emanated from the joints in his armor. As the librarian was able to look at the newly revealed foe with his second sight, he saw that these runes were also linked to the ritual circle, drawing power from the heresy taking place within. "My name," the traitor declared with a mock bow, "is Zal Korak, formerly of the Night Lord's Legion, now a member of Archon the Awaken's Forsaken Sons." For a long, tense moment, the two sides faced each other, neither willing to make the first move. They could all sense the tension in the air, though Lycaon could also feel the eyes of demons being drawn to them all, eager for the spectacle of bloodshed soon to come. The pressure on the veil intensified, and the librarian suppressed a wince when a small cry came out of the circle as the torment of the child increased in response as more of the demons sought to manifest through the circle's power. "What surprises me," said Argus, breaking the silence, "is this display of unholy sorcery. I thought Curs's bastards didn't like to involve themselves with the powers of the warp? Tell me, Night Lord, have you fallen even farther than the rest of your debased kin?" "I am no longer a Lord of the Night," declared the traitor Marine. "Though my veins carry the blood of the Night Haunter, I have renounced the weakness of the 8th Legion. No longer do I cling to my father's blind refusal of the power of the warp. No longer do I refuse to embrace the truth of the universe, instead seeking to impose order to the chaos that is its natural state. The King of the Night, for all his power, is a fool. He has seen his fate and has accepted it, even if it means that he will die with his duty undone, with the lies he fought to destroy still existing. But I will not. I will fight against the false emperor and those slaves who willingly serve his hypocrisy. I will claim the power that I need to do so, no matter the cost. I will bring ruin to the servants of tyranny and weakness." Zal-Korak paused in his diatribe, and took a deep breath. As he had gone further in his mad monologue, his voice had gotten louder and he had allowed more emotion to show in his originally dispassionate, mocking tone. Around him, Lycaon could see the shadows of countless Neverborn, whispering to his soul, dragging him deeper into insanity with every passing moment. The sorcery practiced by the Night Lord lacked the countless restraints and barriers used by true psychers to protect their souls from the powers they manipulated. This had driven him insane, lacking even the tenuous grasp on reason and logic that most traitors still possessed, no matter how far they had fallen. No wonder Archon had sent him here, on a mission he had little to no chance of surviving. Such a creature could hardly be controlled and would end up doing harm to all around it. It was better to simply point it in the enemy's direction and let it destroy itself while doing as much damage as possible. "In the decades to come, the shade of the Emperor that sit on the Golden Throne will order my father's execution," the former Night Lord continued, his voice calm and collected once more, "and in doing so prove that he and his son are not so different. This will be the Night Haunter's vindication, and it will turn the 8th Legion into 1,000 claws that will bleed the Imperium forevermore. So Archon has seen. So it will be. My father has accepted his fate, and none can now change it. But I promise you this, sons of the fool Guilliman, the Imperium will pay dearly for my father's murder." For a moment, the sons of Calth simply stared at the one that, in another rage, they would have called brother. Then Argus broke the silence, his voice heavy with hatred. "You are mad, traitor." The Night Lord snarled, the sound half between a laugh and a cry, and that was the end of the tense truce that had held between the two forces. With the traitor Marine at their head, the demons charged the sons of Calth, who replied with a countercharge of their own, blades held high and oaths to Guilliman and the Emperor on their lips. The two groups clashed, and the slaughter began. Immediately, Argus and Zal-Korak locked blades with each other, while around them Space Marines and Neverborn fought to the death. The runes on the traitor's armor were channeling power from the circle and into his flesh, granting him superior speed and strength. But Argus was used to fight creatures with supernatural abilities, and compensated for it through pure skill, taking advantage of the fact that for all the boost the traitor was getting, he was clearly unused to fighting while under its effects. Lycaon surrounded himself with psychic fire and tore through the ranks of the demons, his advance covered by his battle brothers. Without needing to speak, they had understood what he was planning to do, and acted to ensure his success. Most warriors without the gift wouldn't have been able to do that, but these were Astartes Lycaon had fought along during the Underground Wars, and they had fought more than one demon during these darkest of days. They understood the matters of the ether as well as it was possible for non-psychers, and so understood that as long as this circle was in place and the Neverborn drawing power from the child's terror, they would be at a distinct disadvantage. There was also the boy's suffering to take into account. Such a thing had to be stopped as soon as possible. Practicality combined with humanity, cold calculation tempered by conven for those they protected, such was the way of the sons of Calth. Finally reaching the edge of the circle, Lycaon extended his aura of soulfire, pushing back the tide of demons, before opening his psyche and plunging into the maelstrom of energies, trying to touch mind with the boy bound at the center of the markings. The pressure of the warp on his mind as he did so was considerable, The entities that were using the conduit to incarnate feeling his presence and reacting with hateful anger. For a few seconds, he feared that he had overreached himself, that his soul was about to be extinguished by the collective malice of the Neverborn and that his body would follow suit. But even as he was about to try a desperate retreat, something came from within the circle, a new presence that pushed away the pressure of demon spirits. The presence was shining with pain and fear. It was reaching out to Lycaon on instinct, terrified, seeking someone to help it. The librarian understood immediately, this was the child, trapped within the circle, trying to call for help. The boy was linked to the ether by the abominable ritual, and just as his terror was feeding the Neverborn, his plea for aid was also taking form in the Sea of Souls, the sheer innocence it contained anathema to the demons. His determination renewed, Lycaon pushed forward with his mind, and linked his spirit with the psychic message, going up the chord of emotion until he finally reached the boy. The poor child's psyche was under assault, dozens of demons filling his mind with nightmarish images and dragging up tormented memories. Lycaon felt furious at the sight, and he used this wrath to gather energy. Once he was certain that energy was enough, he unleashed it in a torrent of white-hot mind fire, whipping out the demons that laid siege to the young boy's soul. At the edge of his sight, Argus saw Lycaon's armor blaze with white light, and the unmoving body of the child shine with the same power. Moments before the boy rose to a seated position, screaming for a few seconds in shock and relief and then collapsing again. Something had changed, though, that even Argus could feel despite not possessing any talent as a psyker. The arcane construct that had drawn power from the boy's powerful fears was now broken. And, from the look of things, Argus' opponent knew this as well. No. The Night Lord screamed as the eldritch fires of the circle began to dim and the demons began to writhe in agony as the source of their power vanished. Not now. Not like this. With the interruption of the ritual, the glowing runes on the traitor's armor also lost their light, and the Night Lord's movement returned to the speed of an Astartes. Before he could recover from the shock of seeing his work undone, Argus rammed his weapon into the renegade's chestplate. The Night Lord screamed as Argus' chainsword chewed through his entrails. Blood that reeked of corruption was spilled around the two combatants as they were locked together, until the sergeant tore his blade free, causing another spray of the foul vitae. The wound was grievous, and several organs had been torn apart by the blade, but Argus had known Astartes who had endured worse wounds and remained into the fight, and there was no telling if Zorak's blasphemous dealings had granted him superior resilience. Die, Argus breathed, already lifting his sword to deliver another blow, this one aimed to sever the head of the renegade. Just die. Before the son of Kalth could strike, however, black smoke began to pour from the Night Lord's wounds, cloaking him from sight. Argus took a step back, wary of further sorcery. He could see shapes in the smoke, angry demonic faces and claws that rattled at Zal Korak's armor. A terrible scream came from the shadows, and when they dissipated, no trace remained of the Night Lord save for the black blood spilled on the floor. Argus felt a presence vanish from the room, a pressure on his mind he hadn't noticed until it had been removed. He blinked, and when his eyes opened again the room had returned to more normal proportions, the unnatural power that had warped its dimensions no longer active. The demons which had been attacking the squad were also gone, leaving not a single sign that they had ever been here. For a few seconds he thought he could hear wailing at the edge of his enhanced perceptions, but the sound quickly ceased altogether. Looking around him, the sergeant saw that 2 of his warriors had fallen, their wounds too grave for them to have any chance of survival, and the rest of them were also left in poor condition. If the battle had gone on any longer, then the demons would have killed them all. Once more, they owed their lives and their victory to Lycaon's psychic powers. What in the name of the Primarch was that? Demanded one of Argus' brothers, his bolter aimed at where the traitor Marine had stood. I don't know, admitted the sergeant. Lycaon? I can no longer detect the traitor's presence. My best guess is that the Neverborn punished him for his failure by dragging him into the Empyrean before the residual power of the ritual was entirely dissipated. Wherever he is now, I am certain that it isn't pleasant. Good, said another warrior firmly, eliciting nods of approvals from his squad mates. Deeds such as those committed on this ship had to be paid for, no matter the pitiful rhetoric employed by the Night Lord, and there were few punishments worse than being dragged in the warp by furious demons. At least, Argus couldn't think of any. And what about the child? Argus asked, gesturing to the unconscious young boy Lycaon held in his arms. He has been touched by the ruinous powers. They all knew what the sergeant was alluding to, even if none of them wanted to say it out loud. There was only one possible consequence for contact with the darker side of the warp, no matter the age or willingness of the subject. "He helped me banish the demons," said the librarian softly. "I am not sure I could have broken the spell without his aid." "Then his will must be strong," admitted Argus. "But is that enough? We all know the law of the Imperium, the rules of engagement against chaos sorcery, as they were written by the Primarch in the Codex. The taint of ruin finds its way through the heart of even the most unexpected, and there is no way to walk away from its blasphemous embrace unchanged. Can we take the risk of letting that child live?" The sons of Kalth looked at each other, then back at the infant cradled in the librarian's arms. All of them could feel the all-too-familiar bitter taste of hollow victory, of triumph tainted by unwilling sacrifice. And all of them knew something else. From now until the end of all things, all victories claimed by the Imperium in the eternal war against chaos would be like this. As they crossed the threshold of the ship's best-defended room, Orpheus could feel the curiosity and unease radiating from the crew of the Hand of Ruins bridge just as easily as he had perceived Jikaris' conversation with Archon over the Vox on their way here. The former child of the Emperor took a moment to bask in the attention. Each of the three drew fear from the mortals, although for very different reasons. While they drew closer to their destination, Orpheus' mind took a moment to divine the reasons for these fears. Jikaris was feared because of his mutations. No matter that he hid it under his armor, word had a way to spread aboard the renegade ship. The Fleshmaster was also known to be one of Archon's chosen, those to whom the Awakened One entrusted the tasks that would elevate the Warband. Being a member of the Hall of Asclepius Lords did little to make mortals at ease in his presence. Rumors abounded about what manners of horrors took place behind the late apothecary and sealed gates. Orpheus himself had heard some of these rumors, and it had amused him to see how far they were from the truth. What the Fleshmasters were attempting was generally far more glorious than any feeble mortal mind could imagine, even one no longer restrained by the lies and carcans of the Imperium. Orpheus was feared because he was a sorcerer, his psychic hood marking him as such even amongst the most ignorant of the Forsaken Sun's servants. The crew had witnessed the terrible power wielded by the members of the Coven, heard of their binding of Serek Sithar and of how Archon regarded them as some of his most valued warriors. They also recoiled from his presence because of his armor's colors, which marked him as a son of Fulgrim. By this point, they had learned to avoid the sections of the ship inhabited by the Forsaken Sons who had once been part of the Third Legion, lest they became the newest playthings of the bored marines that languished there, waiting for their lord to point them at their foe. But for all that the mortals feared and respected the two Astartes, they felt only hatred and curiosity toward Ezirithn. Past the first surprise of seeing an alien on board, Ezirithn's appearance was also disconcerting. The firstborn wore a simple tunic, the kind worn by Legion servants, not that the Xenos hadn't protested when presented with the crude garment. Most of the bridge crew had seen Picts of Eldar before, some of them had even seen the Xenos in the flesh, and they could feel that there was something different about the creature marching down the Hand of Ruins command deck. They couldn't have said what, but their subconscious had picked up the true nature of Ezirithn, that of a creature whose soul had passed through the realms of chaos and emerged as something that was more than mortal, yet still a step removed from true demonhood. Coupled with his alien body, it filled the human crew with an instinctive impulse to crush the intruder in their midst. The reborn alien ignored their glares as he walked down the bridge's main walkway with the Astartes before and behind him like a supplicant being brought before his liege, until they were finally facing the Lord of the Forsaken Sons. So far, Ezirithn had been clearly unimpressed by what he had seen, commenting on the ship's crew and the technology they saw as they went through her corridors. In Orpheus' opinion, it was only to be expected. After all, the Xenos had seen the wonders of the Eldar Empire before the fall, and even greater wonders after the birth of the youngest god. But now that he stood before Archon the Awakened One, his attitude changed drastically. An expression that couldn't be anything but awe appeared on his face. Orpheus could understand it. Like him, the Shailat was both psychically gifted and a servant of the Profligate One. While the sorcerer didn't know what Archon looked like to those of the Coven who followed other paths, to him the Awakened One's soul was a dark and terrible wonder. It burnt with a black light that spread around him like a beacon, turning those who walked near him into willing servants of his unyielding hatred for the Imperium of Man. This was no psychic brainwashing or hypnosis, but the reflection in the warp of the Chaos Lord's determination. It couldn't turn a soul to darkness, but those already pledged to the ruinous powers would find themselves bending knees before him, subconsciously recognizing a being higher in the esteem of the gods, as well as one they definitively didn't want to cross. Arkan was sitting on his command throne, with half a dozen screens carried by servo skulls hovering around him, bringing him updates on the situation of the Parascesian campaign. As the group approached, he waved the constructs away, and looked at the Xenos and the two Astartes. The Lord of the Forsaken Sons didn't wear his Terminator armor, instead covering his body with a meditation robe, decorated in sigils of the Dark Gods, prayers inscribed by faithful servants for their master's recovery. To Orpheus' knowledge, the priceless war gear was still in Mercurian's workshop, its repairs being supervised by the techno-adept himself. The sorcerer hadn't taken part in the battle for Merides, but he had heard from his brothers that the Awakened One had dueled a champion of the Loyalists at the battle's climax. Seeing his lord in the flesh for the first time since the battle, Orpheus had to admire the skill of the warrior who had managed to inflict such wounds on the Chaos Lord. Dozens of fresh cuts were spread across his torso, patched up with the combination of science and sorcery that had become the Fleshmaster's trademark. At the throne's side, reading from a data slate, was the one who had been responsible for healing the damage done to the Awakened One's body. Orpheus felt a spike of contempt from Jacaerys at the sight of the former Alpha Legionary's colleague, and frowned. Melicor, like Orpheus, had once belonged to the Third Legion. Though the former apothecary had chosen to display his devotion to the Dark Prince in a more obvious manner than his brother sorcerer, the two of them still served the same patron, just like they followed the same lord. Melicor's aura was alive with minor spirits of the profligate one, swirling around him and whispering to his soul. There were more of them than there had been the last time Orpheus had beheld his Gene brother. Clearly Melicor was rising in the esteem of the Lord of Sensations. Jealousy began to stir in the sorcerer's mind, but he crushed it with a thought. Let the Fleshmaster claim glory by creating more freaks and perverting the false Emperor's Gene work. He would earn the favor of the Dark Gods by deeds a magnitude darker. For a moment, Arkan simply stared at the firstborn, judging the result of the two Forsaken Sons' work. Then he nodded, as if he had obtained the confirmation to one of the visions he had received in the Oracle's chamber, and began to speak. Jacaerys told me that you name yourself Ezirithn, child of Slunch. Yes, scion of the powers, the half-demon declared in his melodious voice. I am the firstborn of the Shai-Ilat, those who, through your orders, your servants have enabled to return to the world of flesh and bone. The Shai-Ilat, Arkan said, as if tasting the word. I see. An appropriate name. Tell me, what do you remember of your time amongst the dead? Ezirith's face took on a dreamy expression, and Orpheus saw the Xeno's aura flare at the memories of ecstasies and agonies the likes of which could never be replicated in the Materium. He felt a pang of jealousy at the sight, before reminding himself that for all the pleasures offered by Slunch's palace to his faithful, the never-born that lived their eternities there still sought to enter the plane of matter and flesh. What he could experience in the mortal world was, in a way, more real than anything his soul would know once he was finally united with his master's domain. I remember much, finally said Ezirithn. But the memories are already fading away now that my soul is once more surrounded by flesh. Though the goddess has little interest in such things, I also remember hearing the wheel of history turn and the galaxy change greatly. Indeed. This is a different galaxy from the one you knew. Things have changed since what most survivors of your species now call the Fall. The Elders are no longer the dominant race amongst the galaxy. No more are your kin the unchallenged rulers of the stars. I know of this. I remember how beings like you came and destroyed our paradise, though they were as much different as they were similar to those of your brothers I have met so far. That is because we have changed as well. Many of us have had our eyes opened to the truth of the universe, and to the tyranny under which we served. There was a war, great and terrible, that tore our species apart and set the galaxy aflame, as those who had seen the truth fought against those who refused to see it. I know of this war. Its echoes reached deep into the palace of the goddess, and she took great pleasure in the deeds of her new champions in its battles. There was a noticeable tensing in Arkan's posture. It wasn't difficult to guess the cause. Slunch may have taken pleasure at the Emperor's children's deeds at Terra, but for the former son of Horus the excesses of the Third Legion were just another reason why the rebels had lost the heresy. There was a moment of silence, before Arkan spoke as if the Xenos hadn't said anything. We lost that war, though in doing so we dealt the Imperium a terrible blow. Now, Me and my warriors seek to continue it, until we can finally bring the whole rotting edifice down and claim our revenge. But the Imperium is vast and its armies legion. In order to make a significant difference, we need power and allies, which is why I asked Jacaerys and Orpheus to resurrect you. The awakened one gestured to the Fleshmaster at his side before continuing. One of Melikor's creations is gathering an army from the mortals we took aboard in our previous campaign. Like you, he has been marked by the Dark Prince, and his influence spreads amongst the rebel. Once Jacaerys and Orpheus have brought more of your kin back into our world, this army, your brethren, and those amongst my men who follow the path of Slanch will form a single force that shall be unleashed on one of the cities that still resist us on the planet below. An interesting proposition, Ezirithn replied. And what would me and my kin gain from this assault? I will let you do as you please with its people, so long as you ensure that our enemies no longer hold it. The same will be true for the mortals deployed alongside you, they are nothing to us. Afterwards, if you want to reclaim your old world, I will let you do it, though I have to warn you, little more than ruins remain of your old empire. If you have no desire to do so, I would welcome you amongst us as we leave this system behind us and go on to other conquests. I will not try to make you my vassals or servants, I know better than to attempt such a thing. What I offer you, Ezirithn the Firstborn, is an alliance. Orpheus noted that Arkan didn't mention what he would do if Ezirithn refused his offer. He didn't need to, it was obvious. Ezirithn stood in the heart of Arkan's power, surrounded by those loyal to the Forsaken Sons and facing their lord. If he refused, he would be dead before his words had ceased to echo on the bridge, and Arkan would either make the same proposal to the next clone or abandon the idea of an alliance altogether. Doubtlessly the Shailat knew this, for he only seemed to consider the offer for a few seconds before replying. To fight against the descendants of our slaves, those who took our own world from us, with the help of the kin of those who helped them revolt, there is an irony in this that would please she who thirsts. Me and my brethren will require materials and subjects in order to prepare for battle, however. You shall have them, declared Arkan. I look forward to witnessing the battle prowess of the chosen children of Slanch. We won't disappoint you, Lord Arkan, said Ezirithn, before surprising both the Astartes and the mortals by actually bowing before the enthroned figure. At long last, the Lady of the Three Seas anchored in Talixorn's harbour, dragged to port by other, smaller ships. It was its last journey, for the ship had been touched by the darkness of the warp, and no crew would willingly sail aboard her from now on. Besides, with the other continent under the control of the traitors and the general conditions at sea following the arrival of the warp storm, maritime traffic was all but non-existent. Once its cargo of flesh was disembarked, she would be dragged back into the ocean and sunk. Tarak had asked and been granted permission to be there. Afterwards, he and his men would join the growing defense force of Talixorn, preparing to face the inevitable attack of the heretics. The captain had vowed to make the traitors pay for his ship, as well as everything else. Argus, who along with his squad had left the ship by Thunderhawk, had promised him that he would have the opportunity. As soon as the ladies' bay was opened, medical personnel rushed on board. Other sons of Kalth had received Argus' report, and arranged for the remaining civilians aboard the ship to be taken care of immediately. They would be evacuated, brought to the refugees camps that had been built in the three hives still under loyalist control. Vast portions of the cities laid in ruins, towers and spires brought low by the earthquakes caused by the arrival of the storm, and the cooperation of the Sons of Kalth and the remaining tech priests had transformed these ruins into temporary homes for those who had been forced to flee before the Forsaken Sons' advance. At the same time, the news that the Forsaken Sons had infiltrators capable of sneaking past their lines sent the whole loyalist command structure into alert, and the legionaries deployed in the hive cities received orders to be on the lookout for more Night Lords. Many of them remembered all too well the damage caused by Conrad Kurz in the time when the Night Haunter had been loose on Mockridge, and for all the cowardice of his gene line, they didn't underestimate the danger posed by the 8th Legion. But as they focused their attention on the hunt for other traitor marines, the Sons of Kalth's vigilance against other potential threats weakened. Unseen by the rescuers, one silhouette left the ship and quickly vanished in the streets of Talixorn. Had Lycaon not been so exhausted after his battle against the demons, he would have been able to detect its presence, but the librarian was barely capable of standing by that point. The silhouette had no name. When it had been created in the Palace of Glass, on Paraxis Alpha's moon, its maker had seen no need to give it one. Names were for people, and though the creature's outward appearance was human, it wasn't even alive in the proper sense of the word. Beneath its skin, alongside bones that had been stolen from the corpses of the dead, was nothing but a greenish liquid filled with diseases produced neither by nature nor mortal ingenuity, but lovingly crafted by the hand of a god and manifested into reality by the work of one of his priests. The plague carrier had hidden amongst the living on the ship, while all their attention had been focused on the Night Lord. Now, it had reached the land of its master's enemies, and was able to perform the mission for which it had been created. Its orders were written on its very essence, and it could no more disobey them as the living could stop breathing. Its task was to spread the gift flowing beneath its hide, to reach these places where it would be able to reach the greatest number of living possible. Food supplies, water distribution hub, transports, the plague homunculus would find them, and leave behind him a portion of the unholy mixture that made up most of its being. By the end, there would be nothing remaining, and the creature would die, but it didn't care. Its mission was the reason for its existence. Nothing else mattered. The gifts of Farad the Reborn would be brought to the denizens of the southern city, whether they wanted it or not. One for the Garden Lord, fallen son of the Red World and reborn son of Plague,